History is not a story of invention, but a spiral of forgetting. Before a world-altering flood erased our shared memory, a divine order of kings understood the hidden language of the cosmos. We have spent all of history trying to remember what they knew. An alternative story of humanity suggests our beginnings lie not with mortal men, but with gods who once governed the earth directly. Long before the first cities of brick were ever constructed, records etched into damp clay described an era where rains fell for tens of thousands of years, and the very flow of time felt alien. This forgotten hierarchy is detailed in the Sumerian King List, a chronicle from a time when the celestial and terrestrial realms were united, and authority flowed down from the heavens. These ancient rulers may not be mere mythical figures, but instead a faint memory of something immense that has been erased from our collective consciousness. When scholars first laid eyes on this list, it was as if history itself had revealed a doorway into a past that was both recognizable and impossibly strange. A single, fragmented cuneiform tablet, discovered in the ruins of ancient Nippur among mundane records of harvests and tribute, told an extraordinary story. It documented kings whose reigns spanned not decades, but entire millennia, a line of divine governors who ruled the world before the Great Flood and prior to the very first brick being laid at Uruk. The tablet's opening line, "When kingship descended from heaven," has captivated archaeologists for over a century. While it may strike a modern reader as pure poetry, for the ancient scribes who inscribed it, this was a statement of historical fact. Every name pressed into the clay, alongside every impossibly vast number, was intended to convey the full authority of divine right. For instance, Alulim, the first king of Eridu, is credited with a rule of 28,800 years, while his successor, Alaungar, is listed as reigning for 36,000. These figures are beyond our normal comprehension, yet they are recorded with the same meticulous precision as the reigns of later dynasties, implying they were never meant to be symbolic. The list makes no attempt to signal that it is myth. It presents itself entirely as a factual record. This is precisely what makes it so unsettling, as it dissolves the comfortable boundary between historical fact and religious belief. Consequently, many have attempted to explain it away. Of course, the immediate response is to say these numbers are purely symbolic, meant to convey immense power instead of an actual passage of time. Rationalizations suggest the ancient concept of time was entirely different from our own. Some point to potential translation errors, where Sumerian time cycles like the SAR might have been misunderstood or multiplied by mistake. And yet, these explanations feel like we're trying to shrink something incomprehensibly vast down to a size our modern reason can handle. It begs the question, why would a civilization with such profound skills in astronomy, mathematics, and diligent record-keeping manage to confuse its own system of measurement, especially when documenting something as sacred as kingship descending from heaven? That very phrase, kingship descended from heaven, reverberates through history like a line from a lost sacred song. This wasn't just a poetic metaphor for the Sumerians. It implied a literal transfer of cosmic order, a beginning that was not initiated by humans. As one of the first cultures to develop writing, they perceived the divine not as something remote, but as active administrators. Their gods were present in the courts and temples, with priests and rulers acting as agents to carry out their will. The King List, however, points to something even more direct. It suggests a period when the gods themselves reigned in physical form, until one day they were simply gone. Following the reigns of these pre-flood or antediluvian kings, the text makes a stark declaration. The flood swept over everything. Once the waters finally fell, kingship was again lowered from heaven, but a fundamental change had occurred. The numbers contract dramatically, and the reigns become shorter. A king who once ruled for 36,000 years is now followed by successors who rule for mere hundreds. It's as if a divine clock had been wound down, or the very connection between the celestial and the terrestrial had been strained, if not intentionally broken. Archaeologists continue to debate the specific flood mentioned in the text. Was it a localized, catastrophic overflow of the Euphrates River, or does it represent a cultural echo of a planet-wide deluge that truly ended an entire age? Deep beneath the ancient Sumerian cities, layers of silt and ash in the sediment offer evidence of destruction, telling a story of plains swallowed by water. But the emotional gravity of the account feels far greater than any single geological event. It reads more like an inherited warning, a memory passed down through generations that something precious was lost, and its replacement was a diminished version of what came before. The strangeness of the Sumerian King List is found not just in its unbelievable numbers, but in its absolute calm certainty. The text doesn't make an argument, it simply presents facts. This is the quiet, assured voice of a meticulous record-keeper, not an imaginative poet. Maybe that's precisely why it continues to haunt us, because it refuses to clarify whether it speaks of gods or of men who became like gods. Was this history a myth, or was it a memory? Did these long-reigning figures actually walk the earth, or were they symbolic condensations of entire dynasties and cosmic cycles, woven into a divine narrative by later scribes? Or, perhaps, were the writers themselves preserving something they only partially understood? A story passed down from a time before their own dawn, when knowledge was sung rather than inscribed on clay. In a quiet museum today, the faint, wedge-shaped marks on the Nippur tablet catch the light. These tiny, fragile impressions contain the unfolding of entire ages, the flood, the descent of divine rule, the very breath of gods. We now read them with a mix of curiosity and perhaps disbelief. For the Sumerians, however, these were the coordinates of their reality. They weren't inventing their gods, they were remembering them. Modern researchers spot compelling parallels between the King List and other ancient traditions. We see it in the biblical patriarchs who lived for centuries, the Egyptian pharaohs whose legitimacy was based on their divine descent, and the Egyptian myth of Zep-Tepi, the first time when gods and humanity coexisted on earth. Every one of these traditions seems to echo the same story of loss, a gradual fading of the intimacy between humankind and something far greater. Could the King List, then, be the oldest piece of a shared global memory, fractured and refracted through countless cultures, languages, and millennia? What is truly unsettling is not just that the Sumerians wrote of gods acting as kings, but that they meticulously measured their reigns. They gave them dates, calculated their durations, and listed them in succession. It is a powerful insistence that these events were real, yet every number they wrote down, totaling over 241,000 years before the flood, contradicts everything we think is possible. Our modern mind scrambles to compress it, to explain it away, to force it into the safe and predictable outlines of our established chronology. But maybe the Sumerian King List was never meant to fit. Maybe its true purpose was to remind us of a time when the world was not yet fractured into myth and history or faith and reason, but was instead one seamless, living whole. Perhaps for the ancient Sumerian scribes, the truth of our origins couldn't be captured by simply counting the years. The staggering figure of 36,000 years might have been their way of expressing a profound concept, a time when the eternal literally came down and touched our world. This perspective completely changes how we view the Great Flood. Was it really an apocalypse, or was it a deliberate act of concealment? Imagine if the gods never actually left, but simply pulled back, leaving behind a world that would one day forget them. Their presence, however, would remain as fingerprints embedded in our oldest stones, our earliest languages, and our deepest collective memories. It's as if those cuneiform tablets hold a silent plea, waiting for us to piece together the narrative. This reframes the Sumerian King List as something far more than a dry historical document. It becomes a guide for our imagination. It hints that everything we call history is just a faint outline cast by a much older, much grander reality. When we focus on that one incredible line, when kingship descended from heaven, we're not just translating words, we're staring into a conceptual chasm. This is the earliest known description of authority as a divine gift bestowed from beyond, not something won in battle or passed down through a bloodline. This ancient list isn't just naming rulers, it's presenting the world's very first philosophy of power. And this isn't the later idea of the divine right of kings, which was often more of a political tool. The Sumerians weren't speaking in metaphors here. They seem to have meant it literally, envisioning a time when celestial beings stepped directly into our world to bring order to the chaos. We know the Sumerians were an incredibly practical people, with precise mathematics and detailed rituals. Their gods weren't abstract forces. They had specific jobs, physical temples, and domains they managed, like the wind or the stars. Yet, the King List describes these same figures ruling for entire epochs. This wasn't religion as we think of it, it was administration on a cosmic scale. In Eridu, where the very first of these kings supposedly ruled, archaeologists have uncovered layer after layer of civilization stretching back to the 6th millennium BCE. Each level is built upon an older one, and the further down they dig, the more the distinction between recorded history and the deep prehistoric past completely dissolves. The city's first temples were simple structures of mud and reed, and its patron god was Enki, the master of wisdom, craft, and the life-giving freshwater that flowed from his subterranean home, the Abzu. According to legend, it was Enki who first molded humanity from clay and then taught them how to build, measure, and write. If the King List is to be believed, Eridu was the cradle of divine governance, the place where the boundary between heaven and earth first blurred and where divine knowledge, the fundamental laws of existence they called the Me, was shared with mortals. In this incredible vision, humanity didn't just stumble into order. We were instructed. Civilization wasn't an accident of survival. It was granted, perhaps even designed. When you look at the artifacts from Eridu, the conical temple towers and the strange symmetry of their early shrines, you find a precision and continuity that feels out of place for such an early period. It's as if the builders were reconstructing something they already remembered in its perfect form. Could it be that what we call the first civilization was itself an echo, a reconstruction of a much older pattern that survived a great flood and a long silence? Among scholars, this question remains taboo, not because it's unthinkable, but because it threatens the fragile hierarchy of knowledge we've built. To admit the possibility that the Sumerians remembered something they did not invent would blur the neat lines between myth and evidence, between inspiration and inheritance. Yet the further archaeology advances, the more anomalies it finds. Precision astronomy in a culture we call primitive, advanced hydraulic systems where metallurgy was barely born, and a script so complex that even its earliest form suggests mastery rather than invention. How then did the Sumerians become the first to write, to legislate, and to record the heavens? Why did they speak of pre-dynastic reigns and divine eras with such calm certainty? And why does the King List, across its many copies, maintain the same structure and sequence of rulers, as if echoing a template remembered from long before? Some point to the flood as a metaphor, a cleansing of eras. Yet the geological record hints at real events that could have inspired such a memory. Around 10,000 BCE, as the last ice age ended, the melting of glaciers caused sea levels to rise dramatically, drowning vast swaths of land. This rising tide inundated vast territories, from the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia all the way to the Indus Valley. Entire coastal plains disappeared under the waves, rerouting mighty river systems and displacing whole civilizations. It's entirely possible that the memory of this global cataclysm was preserved for thousands of years, becoming the thread woven into every great flood story. The tales of Utnapishtim, Noah, and Deucalion might not be fables at all, but the echoes of a shared trauma, a collective memory of a time before the world was broken. And yet, the Sumerian King List seems far too organized and intentional to be a simple myth. Its structure suggests a deliberate transmission of knowledge, something painstakingly copied from one generation to the next, with its core order remaining intact even as spoken languages evolved around it. While the first known copies discovered in Nippur are from about 2100 BCE, Linguistic clues point to the text's origins being much, much older. It's common for oral traditions to exist long before they're written down, but the King List presents a puzzle. The truly strange part is its incredible consistency. Even in versions of the text separated by hundreds of years, the names and reign lengths of the pre-flood kings are identical. It's almost as though the Sumerian scribes weren't creating a story, but transcribing a deeply held memory. This might be why the King List never seems to ask for belief, only for remembrance. Its quiet confidence projects a kind of reverence, not for the individual rulers, but for what they represented, an age before forgetting, when the sacred and the everyday were inseparable. This was a time when kingship literally descended from the heavens, when the world was fresh and language was still pure. The very first words pressed into clay were not commandments or prayers, they were names. For the Sumerians, to name something was to recall it, pulling the past directly into the present. So, as the centuries piled up, they wrote as if they were recovering history, not inventing it. They called their script cuneiform, but it may have been a far older system for preserving memory in clay. As we decode their tablets today, we could be translating not just words, but the echoes of a lost rhythm, the symmetry of their kings, the repetition of descent and flood, all feeling less like stories and more like patterns of remembrance. What if the King List isn't a chronicle of past events, but a map of recurring cycles? A guide to how divine order reemerges time and again to reshape humanity under new names and new languages. If that's the case, what are we to make of our own era, which has forgotten this descent of kingship? Have we broken that connection for good, or have we just lost the ability to see it? The Sumerians perceived eras as the breaths of a divine being. We see them as data points on a chart. Something profound has shifted between their clay tablets and our digital screens. A great silence has crept in. The King List may have been a warning against this very amnesia, a reminder that every civilization, no matter how advanced, is built on the same delicate memory, the memory that the heavens once touched the earth. Staring at these cracked tablets under sterile museum lights, you can almost feel that touch, a faint vibration just beneath the surface of time, waiting to be remembered once more. In the life of every civilization, there is a moment where fluid memory solidifies into recorded history. What was once sung becomes an inscription. What was once a mystery becomes a fact. The Sumerian King List sits at this exact threshold, where divine remembrance was first translated into the measured cadence of human language. But while the text chronicles the descent of kingship, it also hints at a darker counterforce, the slow ascent of forgetting. A profound silence separates the reigns of gods from the reigns of men, a gap in the record filled only by the waters of the Great Flood. In Sumerian tradition, this flood was no mere natural disaster. It was the hinge of time itself, a purposeful severing of one age from the next. Before the deluge, divine kings ruled for hundreds of thousands of years. Afterward, their reigns became mortal. The list's calm, orderly progression conceals a cosmic trauma, a deliberate break in continuity. It doesn't say why the flood happened, only that it did, and that afterward, kingship had to descend from heaven all over again. This repetition suggests a restoration, but also a hard reset. The world was remade, but the text's tone implies that something essential did not return. This memory resurfaces centuries later in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which frames the flood as punishment, renewal, and profound loss. Its survivor, Utnapishtim, tells of how the gods themselves wept at the destruction they had caused. Even in this later myth, you can sense an older idea beneath the surface. The flood was not just an event, but a great erasure. The pre-flood world is remembered not for its sinfulness, but for its nearness to the divine. With its disappearance, humanity inherited both the earth and a state of exile. Archaeologists digging beneath the ruins of the ancient city of Shurapak found physical evidence of this great divide. A thick, sterile layer of river-deposited clay separating one era of human settlement from another. Dated to around 2900 BCE, roughly when the first king lists appear, it confirms a dramatic interruption. Above this layer, cities like Uruk, Kish, and Lagash rise again, their kings now mortal, their reigns counted in decades instead of ages. Below it lies only an empty, forgotten world. The sediment itself tells no stories, it only verifies the pause, the dividing line between two worlds. And yet, for the Sumerians, this was not the first time the world had ended. This belief in cycles shaped their entire worldview, one where history was not a line but a grand spiral of creations and destructions. For them, the Great Flood was just one cataclysm among many, a veil drawn across time, after which kingship would once again descend, and humanity would have to painstakingly rediscover all it had forgotten. This wasn't just a Sumerian idea. The concept would resonate for thousands of years, finding echoes in the traditions of Egypt, the Vedic texts, and Hebrew scripture. It's a vision of civilization not as a straight march from ignorance to enlightenment, but as a circular journey through immense layers of remembering and forgetting. This notion is deeply unsettling to our modern minds, isn't it? We hold so tightly to our own story of linear progress, of humanity standing at the very peak of history. To even consider that ancient peoples remembered a truth we have since lost feels like a threat to our entire map of reality. It raises the uncomfortable question of whether knowledge itself can rot away, just as surely as bone and stone. Underneath the crumbled ziggurat in the ruins of Eridu, archaeologists uncovered a stunning testament to this very idea. They found the layered foundations of no less than 17 temples, each one built precisely on the ruins of the one before it. 17 times, builders had recreated the exact same sacred design, as if they were desperately trying to copy a primordial blueprint across the ages. This pattern speaks to something more than simple tradition. It suggests a profound devotion to an ideal, a generational struggle to recapture a sacred memory that was already dissolving. With each new temple, the reconstruction grew weaker, a little smaller, until the practice itself vanished, leaving only the myth behind. The King's List may have sprung from this very same impulse, an attempt to hold onto a memory through sheer repetition, to carve into stone what the inner eye could no longer see. Even centuries after the first dynasties, later Sumerian scribes copied the list with immense reverence. They likely didn't grasp the meaning of its impossible numbers, but they didn't have to. The act of copying was everything because the alternative, allowing the memory to fade completely, was simply unthinkable. And yet, a strange paradox was at work. Even as they clung to the memory of gods as their first kings, they also began to contain and explain them away. These divine rulers were neatly organized into pantheons, assigned their own temples, and given official priests to act as intermediaries. It seems the more abstractly the gods were worshipped, the less they were truly believed in as a living, breathing reality. Over time, that tangible divine presence was replaced by ritual, doctrine, and the cold mechanics of the calendar. The descent of kingship from the heavens became just a story. The gods who had supposedly walked the earth were now confined to clay figurines and temple hymns, the divine compressed into a mere symbol. This pattern of decline is a story that repeats itself across countless ancient cultures. The Egyptians spoke of a first time, an age of the gods which was followed by the age of demigods, and finally our own diminished age of men. The Greeks had their own version, a golden age which gave way to a silver and then a brutal iron age. The theme is always the same, a slow, steady withdrawal of the sacred from the world, a shortening of life and a dimming of a primordial light. The Sumerian King's List is simply our earliest written artifact of this universal, fading memory. But what if the list is less a history and more a metaphor for consciousness itself? Perhaps the descent of kingship describes the descent of cosmic order into chaos, or of a unified mind into fragmented matter. The gods ruling for tens of thousands of years could be symbols for a long-lost state of harmony, a time when humanity felt a deep connection to the unity of all things. In that reading, the flood wasn't just a physical event. It was the moment of rupture, the birth of the separate ego, of linear time, and of history as we know it. However, to dismiss the list as pure allegory would be a mistake. Its meticulous detail and insistence on chronology demand to be taken as a factual record. It wants us to believe. We are left stranded in that mysterious space between the literal fact and the symbolic truth, right where the deepest mysteries always reside. Perhaps the most baffling detail is where the story begins. It doesn't start with the creation of the world or humanity, but with governance. The text says, when kingship descended from heaven, assuming the world was already present and functioning. For the Sumerians, civilization didn't begin with life. It began with order. It's as if they believed that a cosmic structure had to exist before anything else could, that a pattern was the first breath of creation. If that's true, then maybe heaven wasn't a physical place in the sky but a realm of organizing principles, a higher logic that gave shape to the world below. The kings, whether they were gods or men, were simply the physical manifestation of that cosmic law. Through the centuries, as empires rose and fell, this core idea would change. Divine order was twisted into royal decree, and celestial law became the justification for political hierarchy. But the origin of that idea, the memory of a power that descended upon humanity, still echoes in our myths, our language, and our dreams of perfect authority. The tablet, then, is more than a list of the dead. It's a monument to the inheritance of obedience, a memory of a time when power was granted, not taken, and it carries the ache of knowing we now live in its absence. It survives not as an answer, but as an invitation to view history differently, not as a ladder we climb, but as a great wheel that turns. In its impossibly long reigns, we can read a message, that our civilization is neither the first nor the last, but just one more turn in a great cycle of remembering and forgetting. Maybe, after all, the gods never truly left. Perhaps they just stepped back, watching as we try to rebuild what was once given so freely. And maybe, in the faint lines pressed into ancient clay, they left a final reminder that all thrones are temporary, all knowledge is borrowed, and that even a king who reigns for 36,000 years will one day become nothing more than dust and a whisper. There is a peculiar humility in how the Sumerians recorded their past, a deep recognition that even the most sacred knowledge is destined to erode. It's a curious paradox that these fragile-looking clay tablets, with their delicate wedge-shaped marks, were crafted for permanence, not for show. Clay may shatter, but it doesn't decay. This is why, millennia later, we can still trace their faint grooves and feel the heartbeat of a civilization determined to endure. But what information was so vital to protect? Was it a simple history, a dire warning, or the echo of a concept too vast for anything but metaphor? The list of pre-flood kings, Alulim, Alalgar, Dumuzid the Shepherd, and others, is presented not as myth but as a direct line of succession. With administrative precision, one name follows another. A typical entry notes a reign of 43,200 years before a city like Eridu fell and kingship was taken elsewhere. The tone is clinical, an inventory more than scripture. This very dryness is what makes it so haunting. It states the impossible as if it were perfectly routine. When academics compared this Sumerian list to later Akkadian and Babylonian versions, an extraordinary consistency emerged. The fundamental pattern persisted. Despite new languages and different gods, the sequence of divine rulers was unchanged across empires. This implies more than just a copied text. It suggests a continuous, deeply rooted belief, a secret history carried by scribes who sensed they were preserving a truth older than themselves. Some speculate these immense reigns represent dynasties or even astronomical cycles. Fascinating correlations exist between the reign durations and Earth's 25,820-year precessional cycle. These celestial numbers seem to be encoded in the reigns, often multiplied by 60, the Sumerian sacred base number. Could the list be a cosmic calendar disguised as myth? To the ancients, the sky wasn't a backdrop, it was a ledger of fate. The descent of kingship could have mirrored the movement of constellations, with the heavens themselves setting civilization's rhythm. The most intriguing part of this, however, isn't the math, but the psychology. Why bind divine kings to time at all? Why measure eternity in years? We measure what we fear to lose, we record what we expect to forget. The king list might reveal a civilization that was acutely aware it stood upon the ruins of an older world. Their obsessive precision feels like a desperate act of preservation, an attempt to hold onto the last fragments of a fading age. As Mesopotamian theology evolved, the gods grew distant. But in the earliest texts, the divine is strangely intimate, a presence to be remembered, not just a force to be worshipped. Kingship descended from heaven might not describe an arrival, but a restoration of order after chaos. And if kingship could descend, it could also depart. The flood, then, becomes the moment that sacred order was withdrawn, not merely a cataclysmic end. You have to wonder if the Sumerians sensed this divine retreat. It could explain why their myths are so full of longing, with gods who regret, withdraw, and send cryptic dreams instead of answers. They seem to stand in the aftermath of a forgotten covenant, remembering not through faith but through meticulous records. Their gods were administrators, but their nostalgia was profoundly human. This ache is echoed centuries later in the hymns of the priestess Enheduanna. She portrayed the goddess Inanna as radiant but cruel, present yet unreachable. "You are the light of heaven," she wrote, "but who can approach your heart?" In her words, the divine had already shifted from an embodied ruler to an absent force. Civilization had matured, but the intimacy was gone. In a sad twist of irony, the clay tablets had outlasted the very presence they were created to describe. If the King's List preserves anything, it may be the memory of a time before this distance. Within its dry numerals and quiet enumerations lies a deeper emotion, grief for something vast that was once known and is now lost. This loss is not merely theological, it's existential. The flood, the shortening rains, the descent of gods into legend, it all speaks to a world where time itself fractured. The gods who ruled for 36,000 years are gone, replaced by men who rule for 60. Civilization continues, but the link to that eternity is broken. When viewed from this angle, the King's List ceases to be a mere chronicle of power and becomes a poignant eulogy for permanence itself. It speaks to a time when life wasn't measured by the clock but unfolded across immense cycles, dwarfing human generations. We experience time as a narrow corridor, a compressed series of seconds, but to the Sumerians, it was a vast, open landscape. This profound difference in perspective may be why their myths feel so alien. They were composed by a people who remembered living inside eternity. Yet, despite our modern disbelief, their ancient memory persists in our own culture. We still gaze at the sky searching for our origins, measure vast epochs by the dance of celestial bodies, and tell stories of cataclysmic floods and subsequent rebirth. The terminology has been updated to evolution, entropy, and cosmology, but the underlying longing is identical. The fundamental question remains: where did order come from? Was the story of kingship descending from heaven a metaphor, or was it a fragmented memory of a cosmic pattern that still governs our existence? It seems every civilization traces the same arc: divine order, followed by ascent, hubris, collapse, and finally renewal. The Sumerians simply had the distinction of recording it first. Perhaps, then, what they left behind is not a history of the past, but a mirror reflecting our own future. If this pattern is universal, we too are somewhere on that spiral, far from the source but inescapably caught in its rhythm. The flood they chronicled may not have been of water, but of forgetting, a deluge that drowns meaning. To remember, therefore, is the ultimate act of resistance. This could be why their words, etched onto fragile clay, endure while marble statues crumble and digital archives vanish. This tablet is therefore not some superstitious relic, but a deep meditation on transience. Its fantastical numbers aren't errors, they function as symbols of reverence, an effort to measure the immeasurable. To claim a king ruled for tens of thousands of years is to acknowledge a time when divinity lingered on earth in a way we can no longer imagine. It's why we return to that opening phrase, when kingship descended from heaven, like a prayer. Each repetition feels like it brings us closer to an elusive understanding. This is an inheritance buried not in the soil of Iraq, but within our own profound need to remember. What if, beneath the myth, the list holds our oldest truth, that civilization didn't begin just once but many times? It suggests each age forgets the last, until a fragment like this tablet, a whisper in clay, reminds us. Perhaps our history is just the most recent layer on an ancient manuscript, and beneath it all, the universe's original message is still waiting to be read. It seems that every origin story contains a missing piece, a silent space where something sacred was removed. The Sumerian King's List, despite its precision, carries this same feeling of absence like a scar. It dutifully names rulers, cities, and reigns, but leaves a crucial question unanswered. Who first recorded this history and why? Our earliest copies were made centuries after the events they depict, making them less a direct record and more an act of cultural reconstruction. What if this list is not the original history, but an echo of an older one, rewritten each time civilization rose from its own ashes? This idea aligns beautifully with Sumerian cosmology, where gods were divine delegators, not just creators. Power was layered, Anu in the sky, Enlil in the wind, and Enki in the water, and their combined influence created cosmic order. The King's List directly mirrors this structure. The transfer of kingship from city to city, Eridu, Badabira, Larak, Sippur, Shurupak, feels more like a ritual performance than a political succession. It's as if a divine current moved across the land, anointing each city for a time before moving on. This created a powerful rhythm: descent, rise, flood, and renewal. It's easy to dismiss this as mere myth, a poetic way to explain shifting power dynamics. But archaeology revealed a curious pattern. Each of these cities was located near a watercourse that had altered over time. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were restless, constantly changing the landscape through floods and droughts. Cities thrived where the rivers provided and collapsed when they turned away. To the ancients, this wasn't geology, it was theology, the gods withdrawing their favor. Perhaps they were simply documenting the language of nature, seeing divinity in the movement of silt and water. This still begs the question: why record history on such a cosmic scale and link the fate of cities to a celestial pattern? The key may lie in the Sumerian view of knowledge. To them, wisdom wasn't about invention, it was about remembrance. The fundamental principles of civilization, the me, which included writing, law, music, and kingship, were believed to have existed from the beginning. These were not human creations, but divine concepts that had to be recovered. In their myths, the god Enki distributed these powers to humanity, making civilization itself a divine inheritance. The King's List, then, acts as a ledger for that transmission. Each time kingship descended to a new city, it marked another piece of heavenly order being entrusted to the mortal world. Yet the Sumerians who wrote the list already lived in the shadow of forgetting. Their cities had been rebuilt many times, their myths reinterpreted by later empires. This might explain the tablet's most haunting quality, its calm tone. It documents catastrophic loss without a hint of mourning. Each new beginning is recorded matter-of-factly, as if resignation to this cycle had become part of history's rhythm. The flood comes, kingship moves, and life begins again. It is precisely this symbolic depth that modern scholars, constrained by chronological frameworks, often overlook. They measure, carbon date, and translate, but rarely do they listen. They see mythology where the ancients saw an unbroken continuity. This continuity echoes across the globe, in stories that seem impossibly disconnected by geography and time. Consider the Vedic yugas, the Egyptian concept of Zep-Tepi, or the Hebrew narrative of Eden. Each one tells of a pristine age when the divine and the human occupied the same space, a time before a great rupture cast humanity into a state of exile. These are not just random creative parallels, they feel more like aftershocks of a single, deeply buried trauma. This shared memory, surfacing as metaphor in every culture, finds its first known written eulogy in the Sumerian King's List. It appears less like a history book and more like an expression of profound grief. And if this text is a meditation on loss, what does it say about us? It suggests that we are all inheritors of divine fragments but are simultaneously exiles, fated to watch them slip through our fingers. The Sumerians seem to understand this deeply. For them, kingship was not a permanent possession but a temporary loan from the heavens. Their magnificent cities, like Eridu, once hailed as the very first, were constructed on the forgotten foundations of even older settlements. The further archaeologists dig, the clearer it becomes that the Sumerians were not a beginning, but the memory of one. The very tablet itself embodies this idea of a fragile, incomplete, yet persistent civilization. Picture the scribe in the low flicker of lamplight, pressing wedge-shaped marks into damp clay. He might not have fully grasped the cosmic truth he was preserving, only that it was a vital inheritance. He wasn't just recording facts, he was inscribing a rhythm, the rise and fall of kingdoms mirroring the very breath of the cosmos. The resulting text, with its eroded names and missing lines, speaks volumes in its silence. Today, our attempt to read it is an act of faith, a belief that resonance can defy the immense distance of time. That resonance tells us not necessarily what happened, but what these ancient people believed was crucial to remember, and belief itself is a powerful kind of truth. The empires that followed on that same land, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, each claimed to be the new center of the world before crumbling into dust, reinforcing the cycle. The pattern of descent, rule, catastrophe, and renewal was inescapable. This makes you wonder if kingship was ever about political power at all. Perhaps it was their term for a state of consciousness, a profound awareness of the alignment between earthly order and cosmic rhythms. If so, the loss they feared was not of territory, but of that very connection. From this perspective, the Great Flood transforms from a simple myth into the collective memory of that devastating disconnection. The King's List then becomes both a memorial to what was lost and a compass, charting a possible path back. It's a chillingly familiar position. We stand today amid the ruins of our own making, surrounded by broken records, fragmented knowledge, and forgotten names. Convinced of our own progress, we build and rebuild, yet we're haunted by a sense that something fundamental has been misplaced. The list's ultimate legacy might be this reminder. The act of remembering is also, inevitably, an act of forgetting. Yet the thread of memory holds, as long as we keep questioning the clay. It's a strange paradox that a people so conscious of impermanence would choose humble clay to carry their story. Clay cracks and crumbles, yet it has a secret strength. Fire, the great destroyer of parchment and papyrus, only makes it harder, more permanent. The Sumerians must have known that for memory to truly last, it sometimes needs to be broken first. Every chipped, incomplete fragment we find is a testament to this truth. It is the remnant, not the whole, that endures. The scribes etching those lines weren't just clerks, they were performing a ritual. They believed to name a thing was to give it life, and so by pressing words into the earth, they were preserving the very pulse of the cosmos. We might dismiss these beliefs as mythic thinking, but we are continuing the very same tradition. Every digital archive, every database, every photo we save is driven by the same primal refusal to let time win. We've just traded our clay tablets for ones that glow. And beneath all that data, the same ancient fear remains. That memory is fragile, and that the essence of who we are can be erased. So the story always seems to begin again, when kingship descended from heaven, reminding us that the hunger to understand what came before is never washed away. This list, with its fantastic lifespans and godlike rulers, perfectly captures a blend of awe and apprehension. The monarchs it names aren't really individuals, they represent an unbroken chain of authority. One king's rule simply flows into the next. The transfer of power is depicted not as a violent uprising, but as a sanctioned succession. You won't find any popular revolts here, just orderly handovers. The divine mandate might shift its location, but its existence is eternal. Not even the Great Flood could permanently break this chain, serving only as a temporary interruption in the grand tempo. As the waters subsided, the celestial authority once again descended to earth. For the Sumerian people, this was the ultimate comfort, a sign that even the most overwhelming catastrophe couldn't wipe out the fundamental design of the cosmos. But a deep sadness underlies this impeccable order. What good is an unbroken tradition when the beings who started it are gone? The gods who once governed directly had pulled back from the world. While their authority descended, the gods themselves were no longer a physical presence among mortals. These clay tablets hold a memory that human minds have long since lost, an age when the divine was an intimate part of daily life. This profound sense of longing saturates the region's mythology. Look at the tale of Adapa, a brilliant priest who is offered eternal life but rejects it, tricked by a wary god. Consider the Epic of Gilgamesh, whose quest for immortality takes him across the globe, only to learn that such a gift is not meant for humankind. Story after story tells of humanity's desperate grasp for the divine, only to close its hand on empty air. This might explain the King's List's curious starting point, with governance, not with the birth of the universe. In the Sumerian worldview, the act of creation wasn't finished until order was established. Before that, the world was a formless, untamed maelstrom of primal elements. The institution of kingship served as the vital link between the divine and the terrestrial, the very thing that turned raw existence into an organized society. Leadership was therefore seen as a solemn responsibility, far from a simple perk of power. The earliest rulers weren't warlords expanding territory, they were sacred intermediaries, tasked with maintaining harmony between the cosmic and the earthly. The success of their reign was judged not by their treasures or victories, but by how perfectly they upheld the cosmic balance. But this delicate connection frayed over the centuries. The god-kings gave way to mortal men. The holy duty of leadership turned into a birthright passed down through generations, and the respectful dialogue with the divine was gradually replaced by the cold commands of human authority. The King's List records this entire process of decay with an unwavering, stoic voice. While its tone remains constant, the underlying story it tells is one of profound loss. With each new entry, the lifespans shrink, the threat of disaster looms larger, and the memory of the divine grows fainter. This reveals the most ancient and tragic paradox of our story. For civilization to move forward, the sacred must be left behind. The phantom of this long decline can be found in the stories of many other civilizations. For the Egyptians, it was Zep-Tepi, a primordial era when deities governed the land directly, a memory so distant that even the pyramid builders considered it a legend. The ancient Greeks told of a magnificent golden age that eventually corroded into an age of iron. The Hebrew scriptures recall a lost paradise in Eden. The Vedic texts of India describe the Satya Yuga, an initial age of truth and purity. Each of these stories is a different expression of the same fundamental trauma. A deep-seated sorrow over our separation from the divine is embedded in the foundational myths of cultures across the world. The Sumerians simply have the distinction of being the earliest known people to chisel this grief into a permanent record. Yet their response to this loss was filled with a remarkable humanistic optimism. They didn't fall into despair after the gods withdrew. Instead, they constructed temples oriented to the cosmos, creating earthly reflections of the celestial order. They charted the stars, followed the path of Venus, and gazed at the night sky, seemingly anticipating the return of divine rule. Their entire mathematical system, centered on the number 60, was an expression of this belief in a universal, harmonious structure, an eternal geometry. Through their astronomical calendars, religious rites, and monumental buildings, they transformed fading memory into solid reality. A subtle but powerful philosophy is at work here. The Sumerians chose not to wage war against the tide of forgetting. Instead, they learned to build with its currents. They understood that cataclysms were inevitable, empires were temporary, and the collective memory would always be incomplete. Their faith, however, was placed in the power of the remaining pieces. The genius of their approach was not in trying to save everything, but in ensuring that the most essential parts survived. They knew that one day, a lone clay tablet pulled from the earth could be all it took to reawaken the world to the memory of divine kings. When modern archaeologists excavate these artifacts, gently clearing away millennia of dirt, they are in a way reenacting that primordial descent of knowledge. They are unearthing something far more profound than baked clay. They are recovering a direct line to the past. Every single wedge-shaped impression is like a preserved pulse from an era that refused to be erased. It feels as though the planet itself was a willing accomplice, safeguarding these records under protective layers of sediment, biding its time until a new culture was ready to hear their story. By reading these texts, we ourselves are woven into that great tapestry of remembrance. The King's List has shed its purely Sumerian identity. It is now the shared inheritance of anyone who has ever asked how our history truly began. Its ultimate truth is not confined to the tablets themselves. It suggests that history doesn't march in a straight line, but moves to a recurring beat, and that what seems forever gone has a remarkable way of returning. Viewed through this lens, the Great Flood appears less like a divine judgment and more like a cosmic reset. The deluge may have erased the names, but it couldn't erase the narrative. The tablets shattered, but their message survived. In every subsequent era, some form of kingship, be it divine, human, or even ideological, descends to light up the world for a time before inevitably receding back into quietude. This means the saga of the King's List is far from over. It is a living document, continuing to evolve. Each new find, each scholarly interpretation, and each moment of genuine wonder about its purpose is another instance of that knowledge descending to us. As long as we keep alive the memory of that first line, when kingship came down from the heavens, the ancient link remains intact. Maybe this was the Sumerians' true goal all along, not to command our belief, but to invite us to listen, to sense across the ages the vibration of a reality where time was holy, and memory was the one true conduit between humanity and the gods. The Sumerian King's List isn't a story about creation, it's a story about order being born from chaos. It suggests that long before the first settlement was founded, a foundational rhythm governed the universe. The Sumerians had a name for this universal pulse, the me. The me were not like our laws, they were the essential principles of existence itself, things like cosmic harmony, divine justice, creative expression, righteous rule, and absolute truth. To hold the me was to be in perfect sync with the fundamental architecture of reality. And this finally explains why kingship had to descend from above rather than rise from below. True authority wasn't a product of human ambition, it was the result of resonating with that cosmic design. Flowing from the idea that authority was a resonance with cosmic design, we see that power wasn't something a ruler took by force. It was bestowed upon him for mirroring the celestial order. For the Sumerians, their entire civilization acted as a reflection of the cosmos. Their temples weren't just places to pray but scale models of the universe itself, with foundations reaching into the underworld and roofs grazing the heavens. At its very heart, the king served as the pivotal link between these different realms. Yet this perfect picture of balance was incredibly delicate. The connection between worlds would weaken if the king ever failed to maintain that cosmic harmony. Should that essential thread ever snap, chaos would surely surge back into the world. Seen this way, the King List transforms from a simple timeline into a piece of theology, a potent warning woven directly into the fabric of their history. The entries stating Ululim reigned for 2,800 years, or that Algar held the throne for 36,000 aren't about literal calendars. Instead, they represent flawless reigns and periods of uninterrupted harmony. The sheer length of these eras symbolizes completeness, not the passage of time. And then the Great Flood arrives, shattering that alignment. It was a moment when the cosmic rhythm stumbled and the legendary music of the spheres simply fell out of tune. As the gods pulled away, the entire world shifted its tune. Kingship did descend to earth again, but it lacked its former powerful resonance. The reigns that follow become dramatically shorter, a change not due to a new way of counting, but to the sacred cosmic rhythm itself contracting. Time, as they knew it, had diminished. The King List, therefore, isn't charting the passage of years, but the very shrinking of eternity. These ancient people experienced time as a slow, long, cosmic breath, while we feel it as constant acceleration. Those reigns of thousands of years weren't hyperbole, they were a reflection of a totally different state of being, one that was stretched taut between the heavens and the earth. With the arrival of the flood, that cosmic breath sped up. This is the moment history truly starts and eternity begins to recede. The flood is thus transformed from a simple disaster into the first great dividing line. On one side, gods and mortals mixed without barrier. On the other, a firm line was established. Humankind received a new self-awareness, but paid for it by losing its direct connection to the divine. This very paradox of knowledge being both a blessing and a form of banishment resonates in myths across the world. Take the Sumerian tale of Enki creating humanity. People were made to be servants of the gods, tasked with the hard work of keeping the world running. Yet, through their service, they gained knowledge, and with that knowledge, they started to see themselves as separate from their creators. This quiet act of rebellion is a theme found time and again in mythology. Prometheus giving fire to mortals, Adam eating the fruit of knowledge, or Gilgamesh seeking eternal life. It's always the same deep longing to reclaim what was lost and to reconnect with that divine flow of existence. But what if the King List suggests this deep desire wasn't an act of rebellion at all, but an act of remembering? Perhaps humanity wasn't created in ignorance, but instead became forgetful. The very descent of kingship from the heavens could be seen as the descent of memory itself, a reawakening of a primordial order that the flood washed away. Every new city founded, from Eridu to Bad-Tabira to Larak, represented a new effort to reconstruct that bridge to the divine. Every ritual performed and every ziggurat built was a faint echo of that perfect, original alignment. In this light, civilization isn't a story of forward progress, but one of endless reconstruction, a constant attempt to remember a state of wholeness. We can even find archaeological evidence that points to this profound yearning. Buried under the sands of southern Mesopotamia, the most ancient temples show precise alignments with markers in the night sky. For example, Uruk's White Temple was built to track the path of Venus, the celestial body representing the goddess Inanna. Her cycles were being monitored with mathematical exactness thousands of years before the rise of classical astronomy. These incredible alignments were far more than simple decoration. They were powerful acts of restoration. The Sumerians hoped to reopen the channel between the mortal world and the heavens by synchronizing their earthly architecture with the celestial rhythm. For them, the act of building was an act of remembering. This architectural belief is even mirrored in their creation myths. The story of Inanna and Enki tells of the goddess journeying to the Abzu, a deep, watery realm of wisdom, and coming back with the Me, the foundational arts, laws, and secrets of civilization for all humanity. This is a story about receiving knowledge, not creating it. The Sumerians never claimed to have invented these concepts. They insisted they had recovered them. The Me were timeless principles, simply brought to light again in a new era. This means the King List's chronicle of descending kingship also reflects the descent of knowledge, showing the eternal cycle of wisdom returning through human representatives. The idea is so haunting because of its profound humility. It suggests that civilization is not something humanity owns, but something it borrows. According to this view, every generation is given fragments of a perfect order, which it holds for a short time before they are lost once more. History is seen as a great tide, with phases of descent, embodiment, decay, and eventual return. While a modern mind might see this as a depressing, fatalistic cycle, there's a deep sense of peace within it. In this worldview, nothing can ever be permanently lost. It is only hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right time to reemerge. After the flood, when kingship came down from heaven a second time, it didn't land in Eridu, the original city. Instead, it was established in Kish. The change seems small, but its meaning is immense. Eridu had been the city of Enki, the god of creation and the deep waters of wisdom. Kish, on the other hand, was built on elevated terrain, the first settlement to appear from the mud left by the flood. This geographical move symbolizes a fundamental change in the relationship between the heavens and humanity, a shift away from close intimacy and toward a new, formal distance. Now the gods weren't living alongside mortals. Their rule was carried out by intermediaries. The sacred slowly transformed into the administrative, and divine authority gave way to earthly dynasties. The age of myth ended, and the age of history began. It's surely no accident that the invention of writing happened shortly after this shift. The purpose of writing is to record and save what can no longer be experienced firsthand. In creating cuneiform, the Sumerians were likely reacting to a profound absence, developing a tool that would allow memory to endure even when direct presence was gone. The clay tablet took the place of the spoken voice. The written symbol took the place of the divine word. This illustrates how every step forward that we see as progress also contains an element of what has been lost. So just as the king list transitions from gods to men and from eternal reigns to numbered years, it also documents a shift from spoken word to written text, from a living, shared memory to a permanent inscription. We might label this as advancement, but to the Sumerians, it was more likely a matter of pure survival. After all, isn't writing just an effort to build a bridge over the flood of forgetting in our own minds? Today, when we decipher their ancient symbols and admire their complexity, we are participating in that very same ritual. We study the marks pressed into clay, searching for something more than just words, feeling for the faint vibrations of that original descent of knowledge. And maybe those echoes are still there, because memory, much like wet clay, can retain an impression long after the one who made it has vanished. Ultimately, the king list concludes just as it started, with a descent. The document provides no explanations and offers no justifications. Its only purpose is to remind. It demands no belief from its reader and presents no final answer. It simply leaves open the chance that everything that has happened before could happen again, though perhaps in a shape we wouldn't immediately recognize. This might be its silent communication to any generation that unearths it, that our civilization is built on remembrance, not invention, and that all kingship, human or divine, is merely an echo of that first, perfect order, not its source. So the real question isn't if divine beings literally ruled for 241,200 years. The real question is whether the template they established still governs our world today. Because if kingship could descend from the heavens once, who is to say it couldn't happen again? And hidden among these ancient clay tablets, a different kind of pattern starts to emerge, one found not in the names and numbers the king list provides, but in everything it leaves out. It's in the empty spaces, the names that are gone and the numbers worn away, that we find not just the decay of time, but a deliberate quiet. The Sumerians, it seems, understood that the most profound truths couldn't always be written down, believing that what remains unspoken often holds far more power than what is preserved. Between every royal succession and before the Great Flood, there is a distinct pause, the lingering echo of a concept too sacred, or perhaps too dangerous, to survive the journey from divine consciousness to human recollection. This could explain a curious detail found in every version of the list. The reigns before the flood are documented with an almost unbelievable precision, while the rulers who came after are recorded with uncertainty, their names inconsistent and fragmented. It is as if the farther humanity drifted from its divine origins, the foggier its collective memory became. The pre-Diluvian world is like a perfect image reflected on still water, while the reality beneath the surface is a distorted, blurry shape. With each subsequent copy of the text, the details become less defined, as if the clay tablets are recording not only a history of kings, but the very erosion of human understanding itself. To a modern historian, this fading clarity looks like progress, the moment where myth finally gives way to hard facts and the divine is replaced by documentation. But for the Sumerians, the opposite was likely true. The past wasn't a primitive era to be outgrown, it was sacred. The older something was, the nearer it stood to absolute truth. In their view, the Great Flood wasn't an event that washed the world of sin. It was a catastrophe that buried profound wisdom under a tide of mud. All that survived were not whole truths, but scattered pieces of memory, glimmers of something immense and brilliant seen through the flawed lens of human limitation. It's tempting to think of the Sumerians as a distant people, dreaming in symbols we can no longer comprehend. But maybe the King's List isn't just a record of their world, perhaps it's a mirror for ours. Every generation, in its own way, inherits a deluge. Each era is forced to reconstruct its sense of self from the few fragments that wash ashore. We, too, find ourselves standing among the ruins of knowledge, trying to piece together the broken narratives of our own origins. The Sumerians gazed backward across their flood. We stare forward into a future of unknowns. The direction is different, but the feeling is identical. The sense that history is not a solid wall of certainty, but an open field of echoes. When archaeologists in the early 20th century began excavating the tablets at Nippur, they were expecting to find mundane accounting records, inventories of grain, livestock, and tribute payments. What they found instead was a cosmology cleverly disguised as bureaucracy. The King's List had the appearance of an administrative ledger, yet its calculations stretched into eternity. It was a fusion of myth and mathematics, of faith and formula. This duality was deeply unsettling for the scholars of the time because it shattered their modern categories of truth. To the Sumerian mind, no such division existed. The measurable world and the miraculous one weren't separate. The divine and the empirical were simply two different languages used to describe the very same reality. This is precisely why the King's List continues to fascinate and disturb us today. It refuses to pick a side between religion and reason. Its impossibly long reigns cannot be simply written off as superstition, yet they stubbornly resist any form of logical analysis. The numbers stand in quiet defiance of our binary way of thinking, hinting that maybe the ancients inhabited a world where myth wasn't fantasy, but was instead a form of collective memory shaped into powerful metaphor. It's possible the Sumerians never intended to convince anyone of these facts, but only to remember them. Their tablet reads less like a historical proclamation and more like a sacred incantation, a chant to hold back the tide of forgetting. Each recorded cycle of descent, each account of flood and renewal, served as a powerful reminder that whatever has fallen will eventually rise again, though never in exactly the same form. And perhaps that is the secret the King's List hides in plain sight. Time doesn't erase, it transforms. The gods who once walked the earth may no longer wear golden crowns, but their presence can still be felt in the architecture of our thoughts, in the rhythms of power, and in the very structure of civilization itself. Even now, we are living within the inheritance of their symbols. The base 60 system that dictates our minutes and hours, the division of a circle into 360 degrees, the very first written laws and words, all of these descend directly from Sumer. We still measure our lives by their clock, even though we no longer believe what their numbers signified. Our days turn on the same ancient wheels, but the sacred meaning has been stripped away. The form is still with us, but the spirit has long since departed. And maybe that is what the King's List truly mourns, not the absence of gods, but the loss of context. After all, what is a civilization when it forgets the reason it was built? What is kingship without a heaven to answer to? The list itself seems to pose these questions through its growing silence. Over time, its tone grows flatter and its poetry thins, until the final dynasties read like simple bookkeeping. The divine flame is reduced to ledger ink, the sacred becomes routine, the myth becomes mere administration. It chronicles a descent not of kings, but of meaning itself. And yet, the list doesn't end in despair. It just stops, trailing off into nothingness as if waiting for a future hand to complete the sentence. There is a strange power in that incompleteness. It suggests that this descent may not be permanent, that divine order might just descend once more when humanity finally remembers to look upward again. This idea is echoed in a tiny, ancient tablet fragment discovered in the ruins of Uruk, older than any other copy. The text breaks off mid-sentence, on a phrase half lost to erosion, "When kingship again descended." That single, unfinished line feels less like a historical note and more like an invitation, or perhaps even a prophecy. Maybe the Sumerians understood something we are only now beginning to relearn, that the past is not behind us, but literally beneath us. Each new age builds its cities on top of the bones of the last, and under all those stones lie not ghosts, but blueprints. The King's List is one such blueprint, a map reminding us that the cycles of forgetting and remembering are not failures, but are the fundamental rhythm of existence itself. We can choose to dismiss their tales of long ages and divine kings as pure fantasy, or we can see them as symbols for something much deeper, a truth about how cosmic order descends into chaos, and how from that chaos, a new order is inevitably born. The Sumerians may have wrapped their wisdom in myth for one simple reason: myth endures where facts cannot. Fire and flood can erase entire cities from the map, but stories survive. And within those stories, the faint echo of that first, divine descent never fully fades away. So perhaps the tablet's greatest secret isn't what it reveals about the past, but what it whispers about our present. It suggests the flood is always on the horizon, and that kingship, in whatever form it may take, is always waiting to return. Among all the clay tablets ever unearthed in Mesopotamia, very few inspire the same mix of reverence and profound unease. Its cuneiform inscriptions are calm, measured, and deliberate. But beneath that perfect symmetry, you can feel a slight tremor, as if the person who carved it knew they were tracing the outline of something that could not be forgotten, but was perhaps never meant to be fully understood. The more you study it, the clearer it becomes that this document is more than a simple act of remembrance. It is a veil, and what it conceals may not be lies, but truths so immense they defy language, memories that had to be disguised to survive the long, slow erosion of time. When any civilization first learns to write, it must make a choice about what to leave behind. The King's List seems to make this choice with open eyes, translating the divine into the language of numbers. By converting luminous reigns into calendrical years, they turned profound mystery into a tangible record. Gods who once strolled among mortals were transformed into entries on a ledger. Yet this very act of calculation was also an act of preservation. By translating memory into mathematics, the Sumerians ensured the divine presence would endure, embedded directly into the fabric of time and hidden in plain sight. But what did the Sumerians mean when they said kingship descended from heaven? The phrase is so familiar its strangeness is lost. Setting aside modern metaphor reveals a deeper question. Did they see heaven as a place or a state of being? To them, the sky wasn't a void but a living, layered structure. The stars were the handwriting of the gods, their slow procession an eternal script. So, kingship from heaven meant order from the stars. It meant the same intelligence shaping the cosmos was reflected in human rule. This view was neither superstition nor science, it was a synthesis. The divine wasn't separate from nature, but was its consciousness. The descent of kingship wasn't intervention but synchronization, harmonizing the human with the celestial. Civilization was born not from a quest for power but for alignment. This harmony wasn't merely symbolic, the proof is in their architecture. Early Sumerian temples were built on astronomical principles, with corners aligned to solstices and equinoxes and proportions mirroring planetary cycles. This was no coincidence, it was architecture as prayer, geometry as devotion. Into their walls, they inscribed the mathematics of the heavens. To build was to participate in creation's rhythm. But over time, that rhythm faltered. The King's List charts this decline quietly, without judgment. The vast reigns of pre-flood kings shrink to a human scale. Though the text's tone doesn't change, its spirit does. The divine presence grows distant. Kings become administrators, not mediators, men of dust recording their own impermanence. The language of eternity gives way to the language of law. In this transition, something immeasurable is lost. It wasn't power, but proximity. The flood that divides the eras may symbolize this very loss. It's less an act of destruction than one of separation. The world before was one of unity, the world after one of boundaries, and yet the memory of that unity seeps through the divide. The King's List becomes a bridge, a narrow thread connecting two orders of being. Its writers knew they couldn't restore what was gone, but they could remember its pattern, they could keep the door slightly ajar. The list's endurance may come from its symbols, which are both precise and porous. The number 241,200, the total for the divine reigns, has sparked endless speculation. Is it a code for cosmic cycles or astronomical harmonics? Others dismiss it as mere exaggeration. But the Sumerians were not careless with numbers, their mathematics was sacred. To them, counting was an invocation. That number wasn't random, it was a key, a frequency. What it opened may never be proven, but the persistence of its mystery is its own kind of truth. There is another layer. In Sumerian myth, the god Enki guarded wisdom, memory, and language. The written word was seen as a divine technology, powerful, dangerous, able to summon as well as preserve. Written in this sacred medium, the King's List was more than a document, it was a vessel of energy. Each name and number was a call to remembrance. To read it aloud was to awaken echoes of the first kings, to participate in the rhythm of their descent. Did the Sumerians think the gods vanished, or were just watching from behind a veil? The flood, then, wasn't an end but a curtain, a division of realms. Through it, memory became the last form of communion. This may be why the list feels so timeless, speaking to any era that listens. Each reading reenacts the descent as remembrance. We think we are separate from such mythic thinking, yet our sciences chase the same questions. We map the stars for the origin of order, measuring cosmic radiation like they measured Venus. We speak of universal laws, a new name for the same longing to know where order came from. The Sumerians were the first to give this longing a shape that could survive them. Their list is not a monument, but a warning that ages of reason forget their divine source, and every flood of forgetting demands a new remembering. The true flood may be time itself, washing away civilizations until only fragments remain. But the fragments endure, whispering the refrain that began it all, when kingship descended from heaven. In those words lies everything, the ascent and fall, the endless rhythm between human and divine. They remind us that history is not a road but a circle, waiting to be traced again. Every civilization has a moment when myth and history part ways, a quiet fracture that begins with language. For the Sumerians, it may have been the act of writing the King's List. Before this, memory lived in song and ritual, an unbroken oral tradition. Once pressed into clay, it became static and immortal but also incomplete. To preserve something is to remove it from life, to name it is to fix it in place. So, in their devotion to memory, the Sumerians sealed their myths inside time. The divine became history, and history, over centuries, became dust. Yet the clay tablets never truly died. They waited silently beneath the soil until the earth grew curious again. When unearthed, the first archaeologists were baffled. 36,000-year reigns, 241,000 years before the flood, it seemed absurd. But as they compared tablets, they found a consistency that was no accident. Even the oldest fragments echoed the same impossible arithmetic. Something was being remembered, something too old to fit within the framework of accepted time. This is precisely the source of the King's List's profound influence. It defies our neat little categories. It presents itself with too much systematic order to be dismissed as pure myth, yet its timeline is far too expansive to be accepted as literal fact. The document seems to exist in a liminal space, a relic from a vanished form of consciousness that saw no firm line between the imagination and the historical record, or between the sacred and the mundane. To engage with it is to peer into a mind that perceived a living cosmos, a universe that was itself a grand chronicle. This perspective gives new weight to the phrase, "Kingship descended from heaven." It suggests that cosmic order was the first and most fundamental revelation. The Sumerian world didn't emerge from a primordial chaos. Instead, their universe began with an established structure, as if the first creative act was one of administration, not birth. Their mythology reflects this. Even the gods gather in council to decree laws before they ever begin to shape the physical world. The King's List is simply the extension of this divine theology into the flow of time. For the Sumerians, what we call history was not merely a chain of events, but a direct expression of cosmic law. Time itself was a form of sacred bureaucracy, an administrative system woven into the very fabric of existence. Seen this way, the Great Flood transforms in meaning. It ceases to be a simple punishment or a natural disaster and becomes a cosmic recalibration. The world resets itself when the fundamental harmony is broken. To restore this delicate balance, kingship must descend once more. Creation isn't abandoned by the divine, it is managed through an underlying rhythm. Floods, in this context, aren't absolute endings, but are instead like the intervals between the breaths of the universe. When we encounter the names of the pre-flood kings, Alulim, Alalgar, Enmanluana, we aren't reading their biographies. We are hearing a melody. Each reign is a single note in a cosmic song, and its incredible length is proportional to its perfection. Their unimaginably long tenures are symbols of a deep resonance, representing ages when the human world was perfectly tuned to the divine frequency. After the flood, the music changes. The notes become shorter, the tempo quickens, and the song itself begins to fragment. Civilization grows louder, but its harmony diminishes as the pace of existence accelerates, an acceleration that arguably continues to this day. The Sumerians thought in cycles that stretched across millennia. We now live our lives in seconds. Their kings measured their reigns by the lifespan of entire cities, while ours are measured in election cycles, data points, and fiscal years. And yet, buried beneath our frantic pace, that ancient rhythm persists, faint but unbroken. We still instinctively speak of different eras, of golden ages giving way to dark ages and eventual renewals. We still feel that time moves not in a straight line, but in circles. The King's List is the earliest written testament to that intuition, the idea that history is not a relentless progression forward, but a refined repetition. This repetition, however, has a purpose. Each cycle descends with slight variations, carrying echoes of the one before but never being an exact copy. The Sumerians may have understood that the descent of kingship wasn't a one-time miracle but an ongoing process, a periodic return to a state of cosmic alignment. To them, the gods weren't jealous tyrants but currents of cosmic intelligence. These currents could recede, but they could never be extinguished. Their influence would linger in the law, in the art, and in the very architecture of the mind. Even as the heavens grew silent, their order remained visible in the movement of the stars, the bending of the rivers, and the sprouting of seeds. This might be why the Sumerians never seemed to fear the flood. They accepted it as the price of renewal. Their understanding of the universe was built on this alternation between descent and withdrawal, between revelation and silence. The King's List, then, is less a history book and more a guide to this universal rhythm. Its lesson is that no age is permanent, and every collapse is merely the preparation for the next descent. Divine order, or kingship, is never truly lost, only temporarily hidden. When archaeologists carefully brushed the dust from those clay tablets, they might have been participating in that very rhythm without even knowing it. For what is archaeology if not a modern ritual of reawakening, the sacred act of remembering what has long been forgotten? Each excavation is its own kind of descent, a journey into the underworld of time to bring back fragments of light. The cycle completes itself when those fragments are translated and read. The ancient words are given life again, not through a revival of old beliefs, but through a new awareness. We may not believe that kingship literally descends from the heavens as the Sumerians did, but we still search for meaning from above, in the stars, in universal patterns, in the unseen forces that shape our lives. Our satellites now orbit the same heavens their gods once occupied. Our scientific instruments measure the cosmic background radiation that their myths only intuited. The fundamental impulse to locate ourselves within an infinite reality remains the same, even if the language we use to describe it has changed. This is why the King's List survives. It speaks to that deep human longing more effectively than any modern philosophy. It's a stark reminder that civilization is fragile, not because it is mortal, but because it is forgetful. The real flood is never made of water, it is a deluge of amnesia. And kingship, whatever modern form it takes, is the act of remembrance. Every time we rebuild, every time we rediscover a lost truth, we participate in that same divine rhythm, bringing order out of chaos once more. That is why the tablet ends not with a final conclusion, but with a sense of anticipation. It doesn't declare the age of kings to be over. It just stops, as if holding its breath, waiting for the next flood, the next descent, and the next generation of hands to pick up the clay and begin to remember. The Sumerians may have buried their gods in the deep past, but they left the door ajar. Through that opening, all of history continues to pour, a great tide of forgetting and remembering, of erasure and return. The King's List doesn't belong only to them. It belongs to any civilization that has ever stood among its own ruins and asked, who built the first city, who ruled before the flood, and will they come again? Maybe we aren't supposed to have the final answer. Perhaps we are only meant to listen for that faint echo rising from beneath the silt of centuries, whispering the same eternal refrain of a time when kingship descended from heaven. There is a strange stillness in the idea of the first city. When the Sumerians wrote of Eridu, they didn't describe it as the beginning of civilization, but as a restoration, a reawakening after a long silence. It is no accident that the King's List begins there, because Eridu was the place where heaven and earth were reconnected. Kingship descended, the text tells us, and with that descent the first temple was built, the first sacred measure was taken, and the first hymn was sung. It was not a creation but a remembrance. This principle of remembrance wasn't just an idea, it was physically constructed in stone and clay. A city like Eridu was never simply a center for administration, but a tangible memory given architectural form. The myths of the god Enki tell us Eridu's holiness came from its position over the Abzu, the primordial deep that was the hidden wellspring of all creation and wisdom. The very first temple found there, from around 5400 BCE, was an incredibly humble structure of mud and reeds. But over the centuries, it was meticulously rebuilt upon its own foundations, with each new generation encasing the old temple in fresh brick. What resulted was not one building, but 17 versions of it stacked together, a vertical timeline where every layer repeated the exact same floor plan. The Sumerians literally built upon their past, and this pattern of renewal is the very core of their perspective. The King's List is the literary version of this same idea. Before the flood, the list describes a perfect cadence, as kingship passes smoothly from one city to the next. Eridu gives way to Bad-Tabira, which yields to Larak, then Sippar, and finally Shurapak. It's a flawless rhythm of descent and renewal. But after the deluge, the list's entire character shifts. Power no longer flows in a steady stream, but lurches erratically between competing dynasties and empires. The cosmic rhythm is broken, as if the very pulse of the heavens had faded. It's possible the Sumerians themselves sensed that something had gone profoundly wrong. That kingship, while it had descended again, could no longer find a stable home. This quiet awareness of decline may be the great tragedy hiding within their meticulous records. This slow fading of connection is marked by each successive reign growing shorter than the one before. The numbers silently tell a story of divine thousands of years shrinking into mere human decades. It is the pure mathematics of loss. Yet the Sumerians did not fall into despair. Their grief was transformed into ritual, into architecture, and into law as they sought to replicate the old order through imitation. Every towering ziggurat that later rose from the plains was a stair-stepped mountain echoing that first descent, serving as a symbolic ladder connecting the earthly and divine realms. When a priest made the ascent, he was reenacting the moment kingship first came down from the sky. To climb was an act of remembering. To make an offering was to reconnect, even just for a moment. Viewed this way, the King's List transforms from a simple account into a powerful ritual expressed through writing. Every name carved into clay functioned as an invocation, a method for keeping that ancient resonance alive through the ages. When a scribe pressed his stylus into the damp earth, he was mirroring the gesture of Eridu's original builders, giving shape to the formless. To write was to reconstruct the temple of memory itself. It's surely no accident that the earliest examples of writing in Sumer emerge at about the same time the King's List begins to crystallize. For these people, writing was a way to capture the divine pulse within physical matter. The written word, much like the temple, was conceived as a vessel ready to receive a divine descent. It's even conceivable that the King's List was never intended to be read as a story. Instead, it might have been an object imbued with power. The careful arrangement of names and numbers, its structural precision, and the constant repetition of divine phrases all point more toward an incantation than a historical chronicle. The list could have functioned as both a document and a protective talisman. Its recitation may have been a key part of temple rituals, a yearly remembrance of the divine order. Each generation would reaffirm the cosmic structure by naming the rulers from before the flood, invoking the original pattern to ensure it never disappeared. Forgetting the order of descent was to invite the return of chaos. Modern archaeology, with its intense focus on facts, often strips away these layers of meaning, searching only for political history and dynastic timelines. But the ancients drew no line between sacred and historical truths. For them, every record was simultaneously literal and symbolic. The King's List wasn't false due to its impossible numbers. It was true because its underlying rhythm was eternal. And that eternal rhythm still echoes around us today. We can see it in the rise and fall of every civilization, in each empire that erects its monuments directly on top of the ruins of its predecessor. We label it history, but it might just be the same ancient descent repeating in new costumes. The Great Flood may be long past, but its waters are still invisibly rising through time. Each generation stands on the sediment left by the last, believing itself to be the first to build, the first to rule, and the first to remember. The King's List whispers a different story, that all beginnings are just repetitions. When we examine Eridu's ruins now, nothing majestic remains, just cracked foundations, sun-scorched clay, and scattered pottery. Yet within those broken lines, the geometry of their belief still resides. The temple was built to face the rising sun, its walls perfectly aligned with the cardinal points, as if to anchor the entire cosmos to the earth. Even the smallest bricks carry the fingerprints of their makers, traces of builders who worked not for personal glory, but for a profound sense of connection. To them, eternity was not some distant concept. It was a tangible substance you could touch, soft and malleable, just waiting for meaning to be impressed upon it. Perhaps this is why the King's List can still affect us so deeply. It isn't really about kings or floods, it's about the delicate but persistent nature of faith, faith in continuity, and in the idea that order can be restored after chaos, that memory can outlive any deluge. The Sumerians understood that the flood was unavoidable. Instead of fighting it, they prepared for it through the act of writing. Their clay tablets became arks, carrying precious fragments of divine remembrance safely across the vast waters of time. And we, millennia later, are their descendants. Every time we unearth one of their tablets, we participate in that same ancient act of restoration. We lift their words from the mud, let them dry in the sun, and speak them aloud once more. In that moment, kingship descends again, not from the heavens, but from the depths of the earth itself. The cycle quietly completes itself in museum halls, in hushed translations, and in the simple touch of a finger tracing an ancient cuneiform mark. The flood never erased them. It merely buried them, waiting for us to start digging. The real question, then, is not whether the Sumerians were right, but whether we've retained the ability to listen, because the clay has never stopped speaking. It continues to murmur of a divine descent, of cities that ebbed and flowed like the tides, and of a wisdom that was both borrowed and lost. The King's List is its patient, unhurried voice, waiting for the next era to listen. When kingship first came down from heaven, it might have marked the beginning of not only history, but of longing itself, the longing to return, to rebuild, and to remember. It's a longing that still shapes how we gaze upon ancient dust and declare it sacred. Out in the ruins of southern Mesopotamia, the wind still stirs the dust from old riverbeds, creating a soft hiss like a breath passing over forgotten words. To stand in that place is to feel time itself layered in deep silence. The reeds are gone, the waters have long since receded, but buried beneath the cracked soil are the memories of a world that truly believed heaven could touch the ground. Every fragment of clay pulled from that earth seems to whisper the same refrain. When kingship descended from heaven. It might seem strange that the first known written civilization began not with epic tales of conquest or creation, but simply with a list. And yet, there is a profound wisdom in that choice. A list is at once both simple and deeply meaningful. What makes this list so profoundly meaningful is the realization that it wasn't a one-of-a-kind artifact. Scribes created numerous copies over centuries in cities like Nippur, Larsa, and Babylon. While each version has unique characteristics, some are incomplete, others rearrange names or shorten reigns, the core narrative never changes. The story is always the same. Kingship descends from heaven, a flood intervenes, and then kingship descends once again. This consistency suggests the Sumerians were doing more than recording a history. They were affirming a fundamental pattern. It's a pattern they believed extended beyond their own time, perhaps beyond history itself. In fact, the King's List may be humanity's first document to frame time as a cycle, not a straight line. It presents history not as a forward march, but as a cosmic breath. Each age of divine rule is an inhalation, and each flood an exhalation, with the stillness between eras like the quiet pause between tides. Seen this way, the list becomes less a record and more a map, charting the rhythm of civilizations as living organisms. We struggle with this idea as we're taught time is irreversible. For the Sumerians, however, eternity was recurrence. Living after the flood didn't separate you from those who came before. It meant you were participating in the same eternal rhythm. This participation took many forms, but few were as sacred as the act of writing the King's List itself. Scribes viewed this not as simple record-keeping, but as a ritual repetition, a way to consciously bring the original descent of kingship into the present. For them, remembering the divine pattern was the surest way to guarantee it would continue. This idea of cycles was at the very heart of how the Sumerians saw the universe. Their gods weren't distant creators who finished their work and left. Instead, they were active maintainers, constantly renewing the world. You can see this in their calendar, which was built around festivals that brought cosmic dramas to life, like the sacred marriage of Inanna and Dumuzi, or Enlil's great triumph over chaos. Through these powerful ceremonies, the entire community played a role in keeping the cosmos turning. If ritual was memory given a physical body, then writing was the spell that made that ritual last forever. From this perspective, the King's List isn't just a historical document. It's the ultimate expression of faith, a written testament to the universe recalling its own divine story. Yet nothing repeats perfectly forever. Over time, subtle changes crept in. The scribes' clay tablets would crack, and the language itself began to change form. By the era of Babylon, which inherited Sumer's cultural mantle, the connection to the divine felt different. The gods seemed further away, and the heavens felt less like a home and more like an abstract concept. Kingship was still believed to descend from above, but the method had changed. It now arrived through coded messages like omens and dreams, or was simply asserted by ambitious rulers claiming a divine mandate. The direct, unfiltered connection between the earthly and the celestial had given way to a world of human interpretation. This marked the beginning of what we can imagine as a slow, fading light, an era where the old symbols were still used, but their original, powerful meanings had started to become blurry. You can actually track this shift just by looking at the cuneiform tablets themselves. The oldest examples feel heavy with belief, their inscriptions flowing with a confident, poetic rhythm. In contrast, later tablets feel more technical, even bureaucratic in their style. The cuneiform wedges are carved with a sharper, more efficient hand, and the careful spacing suggests that precision had become more important than reverence. It's a clear move from the sacred to the administrative. In a way, the great circle of cosmic time was being pressed flat into the columns of a simple accounting book. The incredible story of divine descent was slowly being organized into the bureaucracy of human history. But even with this change, the old echo never truly disappeared. Deep within Babylon's most logical and scientific texts, you can still hear the quiet hum of that ancient, cyclical pattern. Their astronomers, for instance, mapped the orbits of planets like Jupiter and Venus with incredible mathematical skill. However, their goal wasn't just scientific curiosity. They were charting the heavens to understand the future, for the sake of prophecy. Every celestial event was believed to hold a message. Every planetary alignment was a potential clue that the divine gift of kingship could be given once more. What were once seen as the literal thrones of the gods had now become sophisticated tools for predicting events, yet the core desire was the same. People continued to gaze at the night sky, filled with an ancient hope, still waiting. Amazingly, this deep-seated yearning for a divine connection didn't die with the Sumerians. Instead, it became a cultural inheritance, passing through the empires of Assyria, Persia, and later into the Greek-influenced Hellenistic world. We see it resurface in countless myths about heavenly messengers, prophecies of a savior's return, and legends of a future golden age. Across so many different belief systems, you find that same core pattern: a divine descent, a catastrophic flood or fall, and an ultimate restoration. Think about the stories of Atlantis sinking into the sea, the exile from the Garden of Eden, or the cyclical renewal of the world in Hindu beliefs. The Sumerian echo is there. It's very possible that the Sumerian King's List is the earliest written version of this fundamental human hope, the belief that what was once divine can and will come back to us. What might be most profound, though, is what the Sumerians don't say. Nowhere in their writings do they pretend to know the reason why this cosmic cycle happens. You won't find any discussion of sin as a cause or any moral justification for the Great Flood. In their stories, the gods aren't depicted as either good or evil. They are simply forces that act. A flood happens, and afterward, kingship is sent down from heaven once more. The pattern itself was the divine truth, making any human explanation unnecessary. There's a deep wisdom in that humble acceptance, a perspective our modern world has largely lost. They didn't shake their fists at the sky demanding an answer for why the divine connection faded. They understood that the period of absence was just as much a part of the divine plan as the period of presence. There's a real elegance to this way of thinking. It suggests that mystery isn't a sign of failed understanding, but a part of the universe's natural harmony. In their view, not having all the answers was a crucial part of what made something sacred. The King's List perfectly reflects this. It never forces a single meaning onto the great unknown. Instead, it carefully traces the shape of that mystery, preserving it like a beautiful fossil that inspires wonder. Maybe that's the secret to its survival, why it has outlasted so many powerful empires. After all, rigid certainties eventually crumble, while profound mysteries have a way of lasting forever. It's fascinating to think that modern-day scholars, as they piece together fragments of the list from dusty museum collections, are unintentionally performing the very same ritual as those ancient scribes. Just like their predecessors, they take shattered pieces and try to create a coherent whole. They use educated guesses to fill in the missing parts, always hunting for the underlying rhythm that connects one fragment to the next. When you look at it that way, there's not much separating the academic in a lab from the priest in a temple. Both are taking part in that same ancient story, reaching back through the millennia to grasp a memory that refuses to fade away. Particularly striking tablet found at the site of Larsa stops suddenly, almost as if the scribe was cut off. It reads, "The kingship was taken to the heavens again," and then the text just ends. The edge of the clay tablet is broken right at that point. We don't know if the scribe was interrupted or if the break was intentional, but the effect is incredibly powerful. This single line flips the entire narrative on its head. Instead of descending, kingship is now ascending, returning to its source. It hints at a moment of divine withdrawal when humanity was left to figure things out on its own. But maybe the scribe wasn't recording a loss, but rather the completion of a cycle. It's a beautiful reminder that anything that comes down must, in the end, go back up. Today, that specific fragment sits in a museum display case, its ancient markings faint beneath the soft lighting. Crowds of people walk past it every day, having no idea they're looking at one of the earliest human meditations on the nature of time. The King's List rests there in silence, its profound mystery and quiet power completely intact. It doesn't have to shout to be heard. Its silence speaks volumes. And within that quiet, a timeless question hangs in the air. If divine rule once came down and later went back up, where does that leave us in the cycle? Are we in a period of waiting for the next divine arrival? Or are we living in that silent pause, the moment right before the world begins to remember again? The clay tablet itself gives us no clear answer, but it was never meant to. The real answer lies in the simple fact that it has survived for so long. This small piece of baked earth has endured through cataclysmic floods, the rise and fall of empires, brutal conquests, and long ages of being forgotten. It exists as a tiny fragment of connection to a distant past, buried under the frantic pace of our own time. The opening words, "When kingship descended from heaven," still resonate, carried on the wind and in our collective memory. They seem to whisper a fundamental truth to those who pay attention, that our story isn't set in stone, but is soft like clay, always ready for a new shape. Every generation seems to think it's the first one to truly see the world clearly, but any true moment of awakening always starts by digging up something from the past. This was a truth the Sumerians understood deep in their bones. They didn't consider themselves innovators who created things from scratch. They saw themselves as custodians of a much older wisdom, something they had rediscovered from beneath the sediment of history. The King's List is a perfect example of this humble outlook. It doesn't claim to be the start of something new, only the continuation of something ancient. By starting with that phrase, the scribes were essentially saying, "This story isn't ours. We are just the ones who are remembering it for you." Maybe this is the reason their long-lost civilization can feel so distant and yet so relatable at the same time. When we read the surviving pieces of their mythology, we find they were asking the same questions we do. They shared our obsession with where we come from and our deep-seated anxiety about where we are going. The great flood in their story, which acts as a dividing line between godlike kings and mortal rulers, is more than just a historical account. It's a reflection of a universal human experience. Every civilization that followed has created its own version of that story, a lost golden age, a world reborn from destruction, and the fading memory of something magnificent disappearing from the world. The Sumerians may have been the first people to capture this feeling in writing, but the feeling itself is something we all share. It's actually quite amazing how much of the Sumerian world is still with us. Although their language hasn't been spoken for thousands of years, you can hear its ghost in some of our modern words related to law, order, and measurement. Their deities also lived on, simply changing their names and clothes as they reappeared in later cultures. The god Enki became E in Babylon, the goddess Inanna became Ishtar, and the sky-father Anu became El. We've inherited their mathematics in our 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles, their sense of geometry in the way we design buildings, and even their ideas of cosmic order in how we structure governments. So today, in our high-tech world of satellites and computer chips, the faint shadow of Sumer still shapes the very way we measure our lives. But despite all these connections, the true spirit of their worldview remains just out of our grasp. For the Sumerians, there was no dividing line between the physical world and the spiritual one, or between science and faith, or between precise measurement and profound mystery. They believed all of these things were just different ways of describing the same ultimate reality. This unified vision is perfectly captured in the King's List and its mind-boggling timelines. The huge numbers in the list are meant to be both mathematically significant and spiritually meaningful at the same time. They aren't measuring how long something lasted, but how important it was, a kind of rating for the level of harmony between humanity and the gods. In this system, the pre-flood kings ruled for millennia because their connection to the divine was flawless. Our lives are so brief in comparison because we no longer know how to maintain that perfect alignment. When we look at the King's List today, our first instinct is to see it as a code to be cracked. Academics spend their time calculating numerical ratios, suggesting what the symbols might mean, and trying to link the reigns to the cycles of the stars. But what if the list was never intended to be a puzzle solved by our logic, but a story held in our memory? The Sumerians often communicated their deepest truths through paradox. They didn't expect future generations to literally believe a king could rule for 30,000 years. They wanted us to grasp the asterisk idea behind that number, the vision of a world so perfectly connected to the heavens that time itself behaved in a completely different way. Seen from this angle, the Great Flood stops being a simple act of destruction. It becomes a symbol of cosmic dissonance, the terrible sound made when that perfect harmony between heaven and earth is finally broken. This catastrophic break in cosmic harmony, however, was never the final word. It was merely an intermission, waiting for kingship to descend a second time and restore the celestial song. With each restoration, the world took another breath, though it was always a little fainter, a little more shallow than the last. Every new age that dawned was a diminished echo, remembering less, feeling less, and lasting for a shorter time. The entire arc of history, in the Sumerian view, is the story of this fading resonance. Yet a profound paradox sits at the heart of their mythology. What fades will eventually return. The flood serves not just to erase, but also to renew. In their theology, death clears the way for a new descent from the heavens, and even forgetting has a sacred purpose. A vessel can only receive a new revelation after it has been completely emptied. For them, civilization wasn't a ladder of progress, but a long, difficult preparation. The constant training of collective memory to be ready to welcome kingship once more. This concept was woven directly into their most important rituals. During the New Year festival, priests would reenact this entire cosmic drama. The king himself would be publicly stripped of his crown and humbled before the statue of a god, where he would confess the failures of his reign. If the omens were right, his crown would be returned, and divine order would be re-established. It was a living memory of the Great Flood, a ritualized collapse of all structure to allow for its powerful renewal. The Sumerians didn't fear loss, they built a ceremony around it. By repeating it, they mastered it. Our modern world, by contrast, is terrified of erasure. We construct vast digital clouds and physical archives, all monuments to our desire for permanence. But beneath this obsession with preservation is the very same anxiety that the Sumerians faced, the fear that memory can be drowned, that the currents of time can wash all meaning away. Perhaps this is what makes the King's List feel so compelling today. It suggests that true remembrance isn't about desperately holding on, but about allowing a pattern to repeat. The rhythm is what endures, not the monument. Ultimately, the Sumerians themselves vanished, absorbed into the later empires of Babylon and Persia. Their towering temples crumbled to dust, and their language dissolved into a collection of cuneiform relics. And yet, in their most profound spiritual mission, they succeeded completely. Their story outlasted the flood of total oblivion. Thousands of years later, we are still speaking their name and reading their clay tablets. The clay didn't lie, it simply waited. One can almost imagine it, late at night in a quiet museum, as the lights dim and the glass cases fall silent. You might see a faint shimmer from those wedge-shaped marks catching the lamplight, as if the words themselves are still breathing. They don't shout their truth, they whisper it with a soft persistence. They say that order can fall, but it can never be destroyed. They say that time can fold in on itself, but it does not end. And they say that every civilization, regardless of its power, lives under this same inescapable law of heavenly descent and earthly flood. It's tempting to wonder if the Sumerians saw this as a prophecy for their own end. The King's List offers no direct clue, but its silence on the matter feels intentional. The text never pleads for its own survival, it simply assumes renewal is inevitable. In the Sumerian mindset, the fall of their own cities would not have been a failure but a fulfillment. The cosmic pattern had to continue. The crucial thing wasn't how long kingship remained on Earth, but the certainty that it would always return. In this light, their legacy isn't one of tragedy, but one of immense patience. It is the patience of clay, waiting in the dark until the next hand can lift it from the mud. It is the patience of stories, waiting for new listeners to arrive. It is the patience of memory itself, which understands that forgetting is just a form of rest. The flood, then, ceases to be something to fear and becomes part of the rhythm. Perhaps if the Sumerians saw our modern world, our speed, our technology, our brilliance, they wouldn't see progress. They would see the approach of another great tide, and they wouldn't despair. They would simply prepare the clay tablets. They would write the same refrain all over again, so that when the waters finally receded, the next civilization would find it and remember. There was once an age when heaven touched the earth. That phrase, when kingship descended from heaven, is the oldest prayer we possess, even if we no longer recognize it as one. It's not just a statement of faith, but a promise whispered through millennia of dust. It promises that what has been lost will one day come back, and that memory, even if it sinks beneath the flood, never truly drowns. There's a quiet terror in realizing our oldest recorded story isn't about a beginning, but about a loss. The Sumerian King's List opens not with creation, but with descent, with something coming down, not rising up. The world, it seems, does not emerge, it remembers. Kingship, order, and civilization are all framed as inheritances from a far greater reality, gifts bestowed upon humanity rather than achievements born from it. History's very first words are already an eulogy for something that has ended. This perspective completely flips our modern notion of progress on its head. For the Sumerians, the divine wasn't an ideal to strive for, but a state of being to be restored. Human existence began in perfect alignment and slowly drifted into dissonance. The flood wasn't a punishment for sin, it was a simple consequence, the natural collapse that happens when the balance between heaven and earth decays. After each collapse, kingship descends once more, initiating another temporary era of harmony before the next cycle of forgetting begins. The King's List is not a linear record of forward motion. It is a pulse, a cosmic heartbeat pressed into clay. Maybe that is why it feels so strangely timeless. Even in our age, which claims to have outgrown myth, we can still feel the rhythm it describes. We rise, we fall, and we rebuild. Every empire imagines itself to be eternal, right up until the moment the waters begin to rise again. These floods may no longer be literal, but they are floods of radical change, of cultural forgetting, of societal collapse. History may change its language, but its underlying pulse remains the same. The Sumerians simply gave a name to the oscillation between remembrance and amnesia that we continue to experience. In their cosmology, the gods didn't withdraw out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Humanity simply could not bear the full, crushing weight of their direct presence. The impossibly long reigns of the first kings, lasting tens of thousands of years, were not crude exaggerations. They were poetic expressions of an unbroken intimacy with the divine. When that intimacy faded, so did the duration of life. Time itself contracted as heaven receded. To live a shorter life was to live at a greater distance from eternity. Our brief lives and hurried ages are, from this perspective, symptoms of that ancient separation. The flood, therefore, wasn't just a cleansing of the earth. It was an event that altered the very distance between humanity and the gods. Water erases all boundaries and washes away distinctions. In the chaotic moment of the deluge, everything became one again. But when the waters withdrew, the world was divided anew. Heaven above, earth below, and memory severed from presence. The King's List records this monumental moment of separation with astonishing restraint. There is no lament, no moralizing, just the quiet, factual statement. Then the flood swept over. The brevity of that line feels like an act of reverence, as if the event itself was too immense for any description. What followed this cataclysm wasn't despair, but renewal. Kingship descended once more, this time to the city of Kish, a city of mortals. The sacred had returned, but it was transformed, now filtered through the lens of human frailty. The kings who followed were mortals with measurable reigns. They ruled not with a direct divine presence, but by its reflection. They were like shadows cast by that original, blinding light. And yet, the Sumerians honored them as the rightful heirs to that first alignment. They built temples, performed rituals, and copied tablets, all acts of remembrance designed to sustain the faint, fragile thread that still connected them to the heavens. Archaeologists digging through the ruins of these cities discovered that the Sumerians built in conversation with their own past. Beneath every temple lay the foundations of an older one, and beneath that, another still. Each generation built upward, not outward, literally stacking memory upon memory. The physical structure of their civilization perfectly mirrored their spiritual one. It was vertical, layered, and recursive. Their entire world was a staircase, rising towards something they remembered but could no longer see. Reading the King's List today feels like climbing that same staircase, now carved into words. Each name, each reign, each repetition of descent and flood is another step on the endless climb between what is forgotten and what is remembered. The Sumerians were not naive dreamers clinging to myths. They were engineers of memory. They understood that knowledge could vanish just as easily as a city could fall. Their writing, their rituals, and their architecture were all components of a grand machine designed to outlast the inevitable. So perhaps the King's List isn't just a chronicle of ancient rulers, but a manual for survival. It teaches that the divine cannot be permanently contained, that floods will always come, and that memory will sometimes drown. But it also teaches that what is truly lost will always find its way back. The key isn't to resist the flood, but to build an ark. For the Sumerians, that ark wasn't a boat made of wood. It was language. Clay was their vessel, and words were their salvation. Think about the sheer audacity of that choice, to entrust eternity to processed mud, to inscribe the story of the cosmos into dust, believing that someone, perhaps thousands of years later, would lift it from the earth and read it. That incredible faith, more than any specific theology, is what makes the Sumerian spirit immortal. They didn't worship permanence, they worshipped recurrence. They put their trust in the cycle. They believed that memory, just like kingship, always descends again. And in the end, it did. The tablets, buried beneath centuries of sediment, waited patiently through the rise and fall of empires. When they were finally unearthed, they fulfilled their own ancient prophecy. Kingship had, in a way, descended once more. This time, however, it arrived not as a mandate of power, but as a legacy of knowledge. An intellectual bridge between heaven and earth was forged through the recovery of these texts, standing in place of the old divine one. For those of us reading these ancient words under the glow of modern lights, we find ourselves the unlikely heirs to that very lineage. There's a profoundly humbling quality to that thought. The Sumerians' goal in building was to remember, whereas our goal in remembering is to understand. Fundamentally, though our objectives are identical, we are just as terrified of the deluge of forgetting. We, too, carve our truths into delicate containers, hoping they will survive beyond our own lives. Our tablets happen to glow instead of harden, but the essential impulse has not changed. Every library, every server, every single line of code is just one more stand against erasure. We are, in essence, still writing to hold back the flood. But a key difference separates us from the Sumerians. We seldom stop to appreciate the sacred gravity of this act. Their scribes worked with deliberate reverence, each mark pressed into clay carrying the weight of a prayer. We write with frantic speed, desperately filling the silence with noise. This might explain why their words, which predate entire empires, still resonate with more permanence than our own. They grasp that memory requires stillness, and that preserving a truth means carving it into a silent medium. The King List is the physical manifestation of that silence, a document that offers no explanations and makes no arguments, but simply endures. It doesn't ask for belief, it only asks for our attention. It comes to us as a 5,000-year-old whisper, a reminder that civilization isn't founded on conquest or invention, but on the sheer courage to remember. When kingship first descended from heaven, it marked not just the birth of order, but the birth of care. To remember is to show reverence for what is fragile. It means building with the knowledge that things will crumble, writing with the knowledge that words will fade, and loving with the knowledge that loss is inevitable. The Sumerians understood this. They did not fight the flood, they accepted it, and they wrote anyway. That is the most profound descent of all. If you listen carefully to the cadence of the King List, you begin to feel that it's more than a chronicle of reigns, it's a deep meditation on time itself. This isn't time as we clock it, but time as the ancients experienced it, immense, breathing, and cyclical. To the Sumerians, time was a living entity, capable of both remembering and forgetting, a force that expanded and contracted with the rhythm of the cosmos. Each king, each city, and each flood was merely one inhalation and exhalation in that grand, cosmic pulse. Through their writing, they attempted to synchronize themselves with this pulse, to capture a piece of eternity in the humble shape of a wedge pressed into wet clay. The modern reader, standing at the far end of that ancient rhythm, might struggle to connect with what the Sumerians felt. We perceive time as a straight line, a sequence of cause and effect, not as a recurring circle. But in their worldview, nothing was ever truly gone. Whatever descended once would surely descend again. The gods might retreat and the waters might rise, but order would inevitably find its way back. The King List wasn't an expression of nostalgia, it was a source of reassurance. It was their profound declaration that the flood is never the final word. It's easy to dismiss the King List as pure myth, but myth might just be the term we use for truths that are too immense for us to prove. Reigns lasting 36,000 years may sound absurd, but they communicate something more potent than mere numbers. The feeling of an era when time itself moved more slowly, felt denser, and was closer to the eternal. When the divine was present, a single day could contain the substance of centuries. And as the divine withdrew, time fractured into pieces, scattering like light across the surface of the world. Some scholars have pointed out that the immense reigns in the list often appear to follow mathematical harmonics, specifically multiples of 60. This was the sacred number of Anu, the sky god, and its selection was anything but random. 60 signified totality, the complete circle of the heavens. To rule for 36,000 years, or 600 times 60, was to be an embodiment of cosmic perfection. These numbers represent a form of cosmic geometry, not historical record. They are the pattern of divine order expressed through the vessel of human imagination. Within that geometry, we find the same logic that gives form to the stars and the same patterns that still govern our calendars. The Sumerians didn't invent mathematics to measure their world. They used it to enter into a dialogue with it. The flood marked a point where that dialogue faltered. Humanity's world grew louder and more frantic, but its connection to the cosmic harmony weakened. The waters washed away not just cities, but also coherence. This initiated the long, arduous project of retranslation, of trying to rediscover the language that once connected heaven and earth. The King List was their first monumental effort to remember that forgotten grammar. Every temple, every hymn, and every measurement of time was another attempt to translate silence into structure, a plea to bring back the music of the cosmos. And that music was not a metaphor. The Sumerians held a literal belief that the universe was composed of sound, vibration that had solidified into matter, and rhythm that had taken on form. To them, harmony wasn't an abstract concept, it was a physical law. A temple built out of alignment, a ruler who became corrupt, or a covenant that was broken, all of these things created a dissonance that sent ripples through the fabric of existence. The flood was the most deafening dissonance of all, the Earth's violent method of restoring balance by wiping the slate clean of noise. To rebuild in its aftermath meant retuning the world. It's no coincidence that the earliest known musical instruments, the lyres of Ur and the reed flutes of Lagash, were unearthed from the very same soil that gave us the King List. Music was far more than art, it was a form of remembrance. Each note was a tiny fragment of divine order, a faint echo of the celestial harmonies that once governed the world. Even the act of chanting the King List aloud was likely a melodic performance, a ritual designed to restore balance through the power of sound. To recite the names of the ancient kings was to make the air vibrate with their memory and reawaken the pattern concealed within the dust. Living in an age of perpetual noise, we have largely forgotten this sacred aspect of sound. We see music as entertainment. For them, it was a form of architecture, invisible temples constructed from rhythm. In its own way, the King List was also a piece of music, a composition of time, a score written for the voice of eternity. When archaeologists first pieced together the fragments of the Nippur tablet, it looked like a collection of static data. Yet, as the translators assembled its sentences, a strange coherence began to take shape. The structure held firm, despite the gaps. The succession of cities, the proportions of the reigns, and the placement of the flood all seemed to follow a rhythm far too intentional to be random. It was as if the clay itself held a memory that the scribes were only transcribing. That quiet perfection strongly suggests the list was copied not from memory alone, but from something much older, perhaps an oral cadence or a liturgical chant preserved across generations before ever being committed to clay. The first history may have been sung long before it was written, which could be why it still feels so alive. To read it is to feel the faint pulse of that original melody, a vibration carried across 5 millennia. The words themselves are simple, but their resonance is vast. The opening line, repeated across different versions, when kingship descended from heaven, is structured like an invocation. It doesn't just inform, it awakens something within the reader. There is a subtle genius in the Sumerians' use of language, sparse, measured, almost mathematical. Every word carried immense weight, with no room for unnecessary flourishes. Meaning wasn't spelled out but was instead implied, given space to expand within the silence. They understood that the sacred cannot be captured directly, it can only be outlined, hinted at, and allowed to echo. The King List, with its powerful restraint, achieves exactly that. It says almost nothing, and yet it contains everything. We now inhabit a world overflowing with words, data, and information, yet our understanding seems to have diminished. This may be because knowledge that is divorced from silence can never ripen into wisdom. The Sumerians balanced both, the precision of a record keeper and the humility of one who respects mystery. Their writing system itself was a paradox, rigid in its form but fluid in its meaning. Each wedge-shaped mark could be interpreted in multiple ways based on its context. The text never presented a fixed truth. Instead, it invited interpretation. This inherent openness is what allowed the King List to endure for so many centuries, adapting to new cities, new gods, and new languages. It was never dogma, it was living memory. And perhaps that is its ultimate lesson. The descent of kingship is not a singular event in the distant past, but a recurring motion of consciousness, a periodic alignment between human order and the greater order of the cosmos. It happens anytime we remember the sacred rhythm that lies just beneath our chaos, anytime we rebuild not from a place of ambition, but from a place of reverence. The Sumerians saw this not as a religious belief, but as a fundamental reality. Through the quiet, steadfast endurance of their clay tablets, they passed this truth on to us. When kingship descended from heaven, it was not just the beginning of civilization. It was the first note in the song of the world. And even though the melody has shifted, and though many floods have come and gone, its echo still hums beneath everything we build. If we can only learn to listen again, we might just hear it, faint, ancient, and familiar, and realize that the descent never really ended. There is a strange comfort in knowing that the oldest civilization we know of began not with certainty, but with remembrance. The Sumerians never claimed to know how the world was created, only that something radiant and ordered had once existed, and that its echo continued to shape their lives. Their King List was the record of that echo. It starts not with an act of creation, but with a memory, a descent, a flood, and a return. Perhaps this is why it still resonates so deeply, because it understands that humanity's first story is not one of beginnings, but of recoveries. This act of recovery can be seen in everything the Sumerians left behind. The civilizations that followed inherited only fragments of this primeval memory, yet they dedicated themselves to translating it into tangible form. You can see this in their cities, constructed along the unpredictable rivers, with foundations meticulously measured by the stars. Their temples were raised to be mirrors of the heavens above, effectively mapping the constellations onto clay structures. They held a profound belief that architecture possessed its own memory, that the very layout of a city could resonate with the divine order that had once governed the world. From this perspective, each wall they built, every tablet they inscribed, and all their rituals were less about new discovery and more about dedicated restoration. It's an act that modern archaeology mirrors, but in reverse. We are the ones who dig through the layers they left behind, bringing to light their determined efforts to reconstruct something that was already gone. With every layer of earth we remove, it becomes clearer that their deep-seated yearning was remarkably similar to our own search for permanence in a fleeting world, for meaning found in repetition, and for clarity amidst the overwhelming flood of time. For them, the gods weren't just abstract concepts. They were the specific names assigned to the principles of order, to cosmic intelligence, and to the uncanny precision of the universe. Their writing, in turn, was a conscious attempt to safeguard a faint trace of this celestial alignment. When you read something like the King's List, you get a powerful sense of just how fragile that act of preservation was, where every single reign and every number seems to teeter on a knife's edge between faith and inevitable decay. The Sumerians understood perfectly that memory is a perishable thing. They knew words could vanish just like light at dusk, and that history could be submerged as completely as their cities. Consequently, they approached the act of writing as if it were a prayer, impressing each mark into the clay as if to summon back all that the great flood had washed away. Their ultimate dedication wasn't simply to a set of beliefs, but to the very idea of endurance itself. While they knew they couldn't stop the process of forgetting, they could certainly work to make it take a great deal longer. The sheer scale of their patience is almost impossible for us to grasp today. Imagine a Sumerian scribe dedicating years to mastering the exact form of a single cuneiform sign, practicing the precise angle of every wedge until it perfectly echoed the rhythms of the heavens. Their script was never intended as mere decoration. It was a profound discipline. The act of writing was a way to align the self with the cosmic order, literally pressing a sense of harmony into the soft clay. Every finished tablet represented a small fragment of balance, serving as a quiet act of defiance against the ever-present threat of chaos. It's very likely the King's List began its life not as text, but as a ritual chant, an oral tradition passed down and recited by priests long before it was ever written. You can almost hear the slow, rhythmic cadence of its opening lines being spoken aloud in a temple courtyard, the words, "When kingship descended from heaven," echoing between columns of baked brick. That phrase alone feels like a powerful invocation. The list itself was probably not designed to have a final ending, but rather to loop back on itself, tracing the story's journey from gods to mortals and from memory into forgetting. To recite it was to recall the fundamental pattern, and for them, this act of remembering was a powerful form of renewal. New empires, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, rose from the same lands where Sumer once flourished in the centuries that came after. Every one of these new powers inherited the language of that older world. They each adapted and reshaped it to suit their own pantheons and their own rulers. Yet, for all their changes, not one of them completely erased the fundamental story of a descent from the heavens. They might have altered the names, adjusted the incredible lengths of the reigns, or shifted the numbers, but the core rhythm of the narrative always endured. Even in later times, when the belief that divine beings had once walked the earth faded, they continued to start their histories in the exact same way, with a gift that came from above. The simple fact of this persistence tells us more than the belief itself ever could. It points to the idea that the true legacy of the Sumerians wasn't a religion, but a unique architecture of memory, a powerful framework for organizing the great unknown so that it could withstand the pressures of the known world. Within that effort lies something deeply and profoundly human. The Great Flood, whether you take it as a literal event or a symbolic one, represents all the forces that threaten our existence and memory, nature, the passage of time, and collective amnesia. In contrast, the descent of kingship from heaven symbolizes everything that strives to rebuild in the face of that threat: order, consciousness, and even compassion. These two concepts are completely inseparable from one another. The idea of a descent has no real significance without the destructive flood, and without that descent, the flood would represent an endless devastation. This perfect duality is captured flawlessly in the King's List. It weaves together loss and renewal, silence and song, chaos and memory into a single, unbroken cycle. Maybe this is the very reason it still has such a haunting quality for us today. Within its spare and simple lines, we can recognize the fundamental shape of every civilization that has ever existed, including the one we live in right now. We are also a people living between floods. The waters that threaten us are of a different kind. They are not a literal deluge, but a flood of data, not waves of mud, but a constant barrage of noise. Still, the essential danger remains unchanged. That surrounded by an overabundance of information, we might completely lose the guiding thread of remembrance. Our civilizations construct towers far taller than the Sumerians could have ever imagined, yet we are uncertain if they are temples to our highest ideals or simply monuments to our own forgetting. This modern flood doesn't descend from the sky anymore, it seems to rise up from within us. Despite this, the ancient rhythm continues. Every few centuries, a new form of kingship seems to descend upon the world. It no longer arrives as divine rulers, but as sudden, powerful bursts of understanding, those rare moments when humanity briefly recalls its connection to something far greater than itself. You can see it in the rediscovery of ancient writing, the birth of philosophy, the great awakening of science, and the quiet revolutions that reshape our thoughts. Each of these events is its own descent of order into chaos, a new light pushing back the darkness. The fundamental cycle has not been broken, it has merely learned to speak a different language. One can't help but wonder if the Sumerians somehow foresaw all of this. It's a tempting thought that they understood every era would have to confront its own kind of flood, and that their clay tablets were intended to be more than just historical records. Perhaps they were consciously crafting messages for us. They may have been writing for the distant inheritors who would one day excavate their ruined cities, puzzling over a people who believed gods once governed the planet. Maybe their greatest hope was that by carefully preserving this core rhythm, we would eventually be able to recognize that same pattern playing out within ourselves. Because even though we may not speak of heaven in the same way, we are still moved by an identical sense of longing, a feeling that something of a higher order once made contact with our world, and perhaps just might do so again. To see one of those ancient tablets in a museum today is to experience that abstract longing made into a solid, tangible object. When you look closely, you see that the cuneiform wedge marks are small and imperfect, some even smudged by the scribe's hand as they were pressed into the clay. Despite these humble origins, they have managed to outlast entire empires. The silence of these tablets speaks with more eloquence than any grand monument. What they whisper to us is not a story of kings and power, but of time's stubborn refusal to let memory be erased completely. For the Sumerians, it wasn't necessary for their gods to be eternal. It was only essential that their memory endured. This might be the real reason they wrote with such incredible patience. Their goal wasn't to preserve worldly power, but to safeguard a cosmic rhythm. They seemed to trust that one day, long after the great flood of forgetting had finally receded, someone would rediscover their words, allowing the ancient descent to continue. And that brings us to today, thousands of years in the future, deciphering their story under the glow of electric lights. While the form of the flood has certainly changed, the nature of the descent has not. Their words remain, both fragile and immortal, carrying that same quiet whisper across millennia that once filled the air over the Euphrates River, when kingship descended from heaven. Maybe the Sumerians had it right from the very beginning. It's possible that what we refer to as civilization isn't really an invention of humanity at all, but is instead the ongoing memory of a descent from the heavens that never truly concluded. It could be seen as the slow, gradual recollection of a song that has always existed faintly in the silent depths of our being. If you go to the ruins of ancient Sumer, you can feel how the very earth seems to exhale stories. Every single grain of dust feels as if it holds a memory of something older than itself, a faint vibration, a distant echo, a name that has been half worn away by the centuries. When archaeologists carefully brush away the soil, they reveal walls, tablets, and the shattered pieces of statues. But the true discovery they make is of a recurring pattern, humanity's persistent and unwavering desire to rebuild whatever has been lost. Lying beneath the crumbled bricks of cities like Uruk and Eridu is not just the dawn of civilization, but the very dawn of remembrance itself. At the absolute heart of that remembrance is the Sumerian King's List, which feels like a heartbeat that has been frozen in time and clay. Its purpose is not to glorify power or to celebrate military conquest. It exists simply to bear witness to the fundamental rhythm of rising and falling, of destructive floods and restorative descents. The list's profound depth is masked by its apparent simplicity. Reading it is like positioning yourself between two great silences, the silence that existed before the flood when heaven and earth were still united, and the silence that came after when humanity had to start over from nothing but dust. To the Sumerian mind, these silences were far from empty. They were sacred pauses, intervals where meaning had a chance to collect itself. You can find this space between each dynasty, after the fall of every city, and with each new descent of kingship. It's like the quiet, rhythmic breath of the divine. The King's List seems to be written within that very breath. There's a strange patience embedded in every number, every name, and every repetition of the line, "Then the flood swept over," almost as if the scribes had an intuition that the events they were recording were destined to happen again. And it seems they have, not as literal deluges, but as the great waves of forgetting that have washed over every single civilization since their time. While our modern sense of history is linear, filled with clear beginnings and endings, the Sumerians wrote in cycles. Their concept of time feels almost geological in its nature, layered, recursive, and vibrantly alive. For them, the flood was simultaneously an apocalypse and an origin story. It was both destruction and renewal. Likewise, the descent of kingship was both a restoration of what was lost and a rehearsal for what was to come. They believed that every ending contained the seed of its own inevitable return. This makes the list feel less like a historical chronicle and more like a living, breathing cycle. It's an ancient articulation of an idea that modern cosmology now calls recurrence, the concept that the world, much like our own memory, must periodically die in order to remember itself. The names of those first ancient kings, Alulim, Alalgar, and Menluana, seem to float through this ancient rhythm like distant constellations moving across a dark sky. We see them as symbols today, but it's possible they were always meant to be symbolic. The impossibly long reigns attributed to them were never intended to be taken as literal fact. Their purpose was to serve as a reminder. A reign of 30,000 years isn't a measurement of time passing, it's a measurement of cosmic harmony. It represents the arithmetic of divine order as it is perceived through the lens of human awe. The Sumerians weren't simply exaggerating. They were translating the concept of eternity into the language of numbers, much like we try to translate our feelings into words. If you analyze these numbers carefully, distinct patterns begin to reveal themselves. You find multiples of 60, clear harmonics related to the lunar cycle, and mathematical ratios that would later appear in the design of their temples and even in their musical scales. It's as if the King's List is an encoding of the very architecture of their universe, a cosmos constructed from rhythm, proportion, and repetition. When the flood arrives in this story, it doesn't actually destroy that fundamental architecture. It merely resets it, clearing the slate so that the original pattern has a chance to begin anew. This perspective might be what gives the list its uniquely haunting quality. It contains no fear of total annihilation. The Sumerians fully accepted that everything has an end, but they saw those endings merely as transitions. From their point of view, even the Great Flood wasn't a punishment, but a rebalancing, the cosmos itself correcting its own dissonance. Kingship descends to the earth again, not because humanity has somehow earned it, but simply because the universal pattern demands it. The return of order is not an act of mercy. Instead, it is a rhythm. For the Sumerians, the divine force was never a conscious will but a repeating cycle. Reality itself was built upon a fundamental law of recurrence, a concept that feels almost alien to our modern sensibilities. We tend to think of the divine as having a purpose and of history as a straight line of progress. Our deepest desire is for a destination, not a homecoming. But the Sumerians offer a profound reminder. Maybe real meaning isn't found by pushing ahead, but in the simple act of coming back. Every time their words are rediscovered, and each time their tablets are translated, it marks another descent. Knowledge is once again flowing down into a world that has forgotten. We may believe we are studying them, but the truth is, we are continuing their work. Their great cycle never truly ended. It simply changed its medium, moving from clay to paper, then from paper to code. Its temple chants transformed into digital archives. Today, the descent happens through streams of data, but the core impulse remains identical: to bring the human world into alignment with the infinite. A remarkable discovery was made by modern scholars while piecing together fragments of the King's List. Without fail, each and every version just stops cold. There's no sense of an ending, no final cataclysm to close the story. The writing simply halts, as if the scribe took a breath and never finished. Some of the clay copies even cut off in the middle of a sentence, the last word left partially carved. For many years, this was explained away as damage from erosion or simply the result of missing pieces lost to time. But what if it was done on purpose? Perhaps the list was never intended to be finished at all. Maybe its very incompleteness is what makes it complete. Like kingship itself, history must always be left open, awaiting the next descent from above. The Sumerians seem to have viewed writing as a way to take part in the eternal. Carving marks into clay was, for them, a sacred process, a descent of pure thought into physical matter, of fleeting breath into permanence. Each press of the stylus was an echo of the universe's first creative act, when form was born from chaos. To write was to reenact Genesis. This powerful belief might explain why their texts still seem to pulse with life. The scribes weren't just recording events, they were summoning a reality. And yet, the list's most profound truth might be found in its humility. Despite its grandeur, it makes no claim to know everything. The text openly acknowledges its own limitations. Between each dynasty, there is a gap, a profound silence that no scribe ever attempted to fill. The list simply accepts the things it cannot know, and within that acceptance lies its timeless wisdom. The Sumerians understood that mystery isn't a sign of ignorance but a form of reverence. The things that cannot be written down must still be held in memory. This humble perspective stands in sharp contrast to our own era, which is terrified of gaps and rushes to plug every silence with a new explanation. We chase after certainty where the ancients looked for balance. They judged the truth of a belief not by its provable accuracy, but by its harmony, by whether it resonated with the cosmic order. The King's List has endured precisely because it embodies that resonance. It doesn't try to explain or make demands. It simply is, existing in a quiet balance with the unknown. Maybe this is why its words can still affect us so deeply. It's not that we believe the stories, but that we recognize a piece of ourselves in its silences. We are also creatures living between floods. We also build things and lose them. We remember and we forget. We also feel that subtle pull of something greater, something that once descended and could, one day, return. The list whispers to us that this rhythm isn't a tragedy, but a form of grace. It tells us that to start over is not a failure, but the universe taking a deep breath. The very clay that holds the King's List is nothing special. It's coarse, brown, and brittle. And yet this humble material has managed to outlive every single empire that ever chased after eternity. That, too, is part of the lesson. What lasts is never what is grand or powerful, but the simple, humble act of remembering. A scribe holding a reed, pressing a line into wet clay, that is all that is needed to stand against the flood. Kingship descended from heaven, the Sumerians wrote. And perhaps it is still descending, not with thunder and lightning, but as a thought, a moment of wonder, or the quiet realization that time isn't just moving away from its origin, but is slowly, surely, returning to it. The list is the map of that return, and its final destination is not the past, but the act of remembrance itself. There is a quality to the end of the Sumerian King's List that is almost unbearable. It doesn't conclude, it vanishes. The words just cease, as if the writer's hand froze in midair, leaving a thought suspended between two worlds. That silence feels intentional, as if the Sumerians wanted their final statement to dissolve instead of close, to drift back into the same mystery it came from. For a civilization so focused on memory, there is a deep poetry in ending with an incomplete thought. Perhaps they knew that no record can ever truly contain the divine, that the very moment you try to capture eternity, it slips through your fingers. The more we learn about Sumer, the more obvious this paradox becomes. They constructed the world's first cities, yet their myths are dominated by stories of floods. They were the inventors of writing, yet their most important text remains unfinished. They meticulously measured the movements of the stars, yet they described heaven not as a physical place, but as a rhythm. To them, order wasn't a permanent state. It was cyclical, constantly descending, and then withdrawing. Kingship was not an act of conquest, but one of stewardship. It was a gift from heaven, not to dominate the earth, but to remind it of harmony. Each time kingship descended, the world was briefly brought back into alignment, like a musical chord struck between the heavens and the clay below. It's easy to picture the scribes who copied the list, sitting in mud-brick rooms by lamplight, carefully pressing reeds into damp tablets as the river wind whistled through the shutters. They probably knew their empires would eventually fade, their gods would be called by other names, and their temples would fall to ruin. But they wrote anyway because the act of writing was an act of resistance against oblivion. The act itself was a statement of faith, a declaration that meaning could survive the flood. They didn't expect to be remembered as individuals, they expected the pattern to continue, and it has. The flood has returned many times since then, taking many forms, fire, war, and forgetting. And yet, the clay survives. Each rediscovery of their words marks another descent of kingship, knowledge rising back to the surface. When the tablets were first dug up in the 19th century, their language was a complete mystery. The wedge-shaped marks were dismissed as mere decoration. It was only later, once cuneiform was finally deciphered, that the ancient whisper became audible again. And as it did, that ancient rhythm began to stir once more. The King's List spoke, and humanity remembered that it had been here before. That incredible moment, when modern scholars first grasped the meaning of those words, is a mirror of the descent itself. From silence, meaning emerged. From clay, memory was reborn. It is as if the old gods had not disappeared but had merely changed their form, waiting patiently for us to remember how to read their language. The Sumerians would have smiled at that idea. They always believed that divine wisdom simply sleeps until it is called upon. Knowledge never dies. It just waits for new tools to awaken it. In this sense, the Sumerian King's List is much more than an archaeological find. It is a prophecy being fulfilled across time. Its cycles of descent and flood are not just cosmic events, but psychological echoes of how consciousness itself rises and falls. Every civilization, and indeed every individual mind, carries its own version of the flood, those moments when meaning collapses and the world feels adrift. And every renaissance, every great rediscovery, is another descent of kingship, another spark of order returning from the silence. The Sumerians wouldn't have called this optimism, they would have called it balance. For them, chaos was not an evil force. It was the raw clay from which all form was shaped. The flood and kingship were not enemies, they were partners in the dance of creation. To live inside that rhythm was to accept that destruction is also sacred. Perhaps this is the greatest wisdom they left for us, the courage to allow things to end, trusting that whatever truly matters will always descend again. As we study their fragments today, we can see how their vision of time aligns in a curious way with what modern science is beginning to reveal. Cosmologists now talk of cyclical universes, of cosmic expansions and contractions, of entropy followed by renewal, a kind of cosmic breathing that sounds very much like the Sumerian concept of descent and flood. The same core intuition is now appearing in physics, in myth, and in biology. It is as if the world's oldest civilization and our newest science are looking at the exact same truth, just through different eyes, that the universe doesn't progress in a line, it pulses. But where science describes, the Sumerians remembered. Their knowledge was experiential, embodied in their rituals, their architecture, and in the slow, steady rhythm of planting and harvesting. They felt the descent not as a theory but as an atmosphere, in the seasonal rains that always returned, in the stars that would realign in the sky, and in the steady breathing of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Their world was alive with recurrence. For them, immortality was not about escaping time, but about participating in its cycles with grace. That grace can still be felt. When we look at the ruins of their temples, we see not grandeur but patience, stones stacked upon older stones, endlessly rebuilt after each flood. When we read their words, we hear not certainty but reverence. The Sumerians never claimed to own the truth, they only promised to remember it long enough for the next generation to find it again. This is why their clay has endured while marble has turned to dust. Humility, not might, is what truly survives. And in that humility, we find something that feels startlingly modern. The Sumerians did not separate myth from science, as they saw no boundary between faith and observation. Their worldview was shaped by a profound understanding that knowledge becomes lifeless when it is stripped of its sense of awe. They knew that facts, by themselves, are incapable of supporting the immense weight of genuine wonder. The Sumerian King List itself is a powerful demonstration of this belief, a masterful act of synthesis. It is simultaneously a work of mathematics, a piece of sacred liturgy, and a shared dream. This document represents one of humanity's very first attempts to reconcile the world of logic with the realm of mystery, a profound undertaking that we are still engaged in today. Perhaps this is the reason the list continues to resonate with us across the millennia. It serves as a potent reminder that history itself is a sacred space, and that memory is a temple we are called to continuously rebuild. Every new generation contributes another layer, not with the goal of perfecting the structure, but to maintain its vital rhythm. The Sumerians understood that perfection was never the objective. The true goal was endurance. They put their faith in the flood, confident that after everything else was washed away, the clay would survive. And it has. Their words, carefully etched into the earth, have managed to outlive bronze and iron, to survive empires and creeds. These records have even outlasted the very rivers that gave birth to their civilization. Their longevity comes from the fact they never laid claim to permanence. Instead, they only offered the promise of a return. When they wrote that kingship descended from heaven, that single line contained their entire cosmology: the rise, the fall, the silence, and the song. It's possible the list concludes so suddenly because it was never intended to have an end. Maybe the scribe simply stopped writing, knowing full well that the remainder of the story would be written by others, by us. The flood is destined to return, as it always does. The clay is destined to be buried once more, as it always has been. The essential rhythm, however, is destined to continue, as it always must. Somewhere, hidden beneath the dust of cities long forgotten or illuminated by the glow of our own screens, the same words will eventually whisper again: kingship has descended once more. It begins just as it always has, with silence. This is the same quiet that existed before the first descent, before the initial mark of a stylus ever met the wet clay. It is a silence that waits, with the patience of the earth itself, for memory to find its way back. The Sumerians were intimately familiar with this silence. They existed within it, they built their world upon it, and they communicated through it. Every temple they erected, every song they composed, every inscription they carved was an effort to span the quiet gulf between heaven and earth. The King's List was their attempt to make that bridge permanent, the lasting whisper of a world that was determined not to forget. And yet, as the final, crumbling fragments of the tablets reveal, even their bridge was not immune to the forces of erosion. The text crumbles into pieces, its last kings fading into lines that are barely legible. The final words are little more than faint traces of meaning, a sentence consumed by the passage of time. This gradual vanishing, however, feels less like a loss and more like a fulfillment. It's as if the list itself understood that history, when it stretches too far into the past, must ultimately yield to silence once again. For the Sumerians, every descent concludes at its starting point, in the quiet from which the divine first emerged. This might explain why the list does not end with a lament. There is no desperate cry for an eternal existence, no plea for preservation. It simply stops, much like a person pausing to take a breath before the next cycle begins. To the modern observer, such incompleteness might seem like a tragedy, but to the Sumerian way of thinking, it was a necessity. The flood would inevitably return. The clay would one day crack. The words would eventually be rewritten in a different language by another hand. The unfinished tablet was not a sign of failure. It was an invitation. And whether we realize it or not, we have accepted that invitation. Each time we unearth a tablet, translate a small fragment, or speak their ancient words aloud, we become participants in the very same cycle. The descent is still happening, though no longer in the form of divine kingship. Instead, it continues as understanding, as awareness, and as remembrance. The clay has simply taken on a new form. The heavens have receded from our view, but the underlying rhythm carries on. The list is still being written, not with reed on mud, but in our thoughts, in our collective memory, and in the enduring power of human curiosity. It is a humbling realization that the most ancient record of human history is not really about humanity at all. It starts with gods, with a celestial order, and with forces that shaped our existence long before we had the words to name them. The Sumerians did not view themselves as the creators of civilization, but rather as the caretakers of something handed down to them, something sacred, ancient, and ultimately incomprehensible. Kingship did not spring up from the soil. It descended upon them like light, like music, like a memory far too vast to be contained by a single age. Their act of writing was not one of invention but of continuation. It was not a proclamation, but an act of listening. That specific attitude, the humility to receive rather than to claim, might just be the truest indicator of their greatness. Modern civilization celebrates progress and prides itself on creating things from nothing. The Sumerians, however, would have likely smiled at such a notion. In their view, nothing genuinely new ever came into being. Everything was a descent, a reappearance, a timeless pattern being replayed in a new context. To remember was to take part in the act of creation. To forget was to be dissolved by the flood. This fundamental rhythm, descent, flood, and renewal, shapes not only their mythology but also their architecture, their mathematics, and even their perspective on death. They didn't conceive of an afterlife as a paradise or a punishment, but simply as a continuation. Life was just one layer built upon a deeper, older layer. The dead did not simply vanish. They became part of the sediment of memory from which the next generation would build its world. Every burial mound, every ziggurat, and every temple foundation was simultaneously a tomb and a seed. The King's List mirrors that exact cosmology. It is an ascent constructed from countless descents, with each new reign built upon the ruins of the one before it. As we look back across 5,000 years, it's tempting to believe the Sumerians are gone, that their world of gods and floods has been replaced by one of data and light. Yet the echo of their world is still found in ours. We count using their numbers. We retell their myths in our own languages. We structure our lives by their measurements of hours and days. We still design our cities in grids that are aligned with the stars, just as they did. We continue to search for meaning in cycles, and we still erect towers hoping to connect the earth and the sky. The descent goes on, only now it is subtler, hidden in the pulse of electricity and the quiet hum of our machines. And perhaps, deep beneath the surface of all our progress, the same ancient fear still stirs, the fear of forgetting. The Sumerians built their entire civilization to guard against that fear. They transformed mud into memory and time into a tangible substance. We do the very same thing, only our materials are glass and code. We construct vast archives, databases, and networks, digital ziggurats reaching toward invisible heavens. Yet the fundamental question has not changed. Will our records survive when the next flood arrives? What form of clay will preserve our story? Maybe this is what the Sumerians were warning us about all along, not through a direct prophecy, but through a pattern. The flood is not made of water, it is the force of erasure. It comes whenever humanity starts to believe it has finally escaped the cycle. It appears whenever we forget that descent and humility are the true foundations of order. Their King's List, simple and unyielding, serves as both a memory and a mirror. It reflects not just their time, but all of time. It shows the eternal struggle to remember what once descended from above, and to keep that memory alive against the inevitable tide. Somewhere in a museum, bathed in sterile light, one of those tablets still holds the faint imprint of a scribe's fingertip. It's a delicate ridge of skin that was pressed into the clay 5 millennia ago, a mark so small it could easily be mistaken for an imperfection. Yet, it is quite possibly the truest symbol of the entire list. The human touch upon the divine order, the trace of a mortal hand preserving the rhythm of the immortal. That fingerprint is a form of kingship, too, not one of power but of presence. It is the link between heaven and earth made tangible. As we conclude this journey, it's impossible not to see the symmetry. The Sumerians once looked back at a world that had been erased by water, and we now look back at them through the great flood of time. Both actions are fundamentally the same, an attempt to remember through ruins and to rebuild through storytelling. We are not their descendants by blood, but by memory. The very clay they shaped has now become the mirror we peer into, where we see our own reflection in its ancient pattern. The phrase, "when kingship descended from heaven," still resonates with profound weight, not as a myth but as a reminder. It tells us that civilization itself is not an invention, but an act of remembrance. It suggests that every discovery we make is actually a rediscovery. It teaches us that wisdom does not originate in the present but returns to it. The Sumerians wrote their story for the future, trusting that when the great silence lifted once again, someone would be there to listen. And we have listened. We have found their words, pieced them together, and read them aloud once more. The descent has occurred again, this time softly and invisibly through thought and translation. The flood will come again as it must, but so too will the remembrance. That is the promise sealed within the clay. The King's List, incomplete yet eternal, ends precisely where it began, in the silence before the next